Welcome to episode 10 of Let's Rage Together, a podcast where two friends talk about the politics of total liberation and related topics.
We annihilated the world before your very ears.
You can't handle the truth.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the 10th episode of Let's Rage
What?
Together.
Number
Very
10.
crazy. I'm
X.
Taryn,
And I'm Pete.
and for this very momentous occasion, we bring you a mammoth episode, which also happens to be our very first interview.
Whoop whoop.
So today we are speaking to Aragorn Eloff, all about anarchism. So if that's your vibe, check it out, keep listening. And since it's quite a long episode, we're just going to dive straight into the interview without any extra segments or anything like that. And as always, if you want to get in touch with us with any questions or comments, you can reach us at Let's Rage Together Podcast @gmail.com or on social media at Let's Rage Together Podcast. And if you want to support what we're doing, you can check out our website, letsragetogether.co.za. We have Patreon, we have PayPal, and more importantly, if you just want to share our episodes or the podcast with someone who might enjoy it, we would very much appreciate it. But without any further ado, enjoy the interview.
I first met Aragorn at an anarchist vegan coffee info shop in Muizenberg in 2011 called bolo'bolo. At the time, I was very new to anarchism and had only heard and kind of got this like really bad representation of it through punk rock when I was younger. So pretty much through there, I started to read and learn more about it, and then I got more involved with things that Aragorn and the bolo'bolo Anarchist Collective were doing, such as like food not bombs and film screenings, and then the Cape Town Anarchist Book Fair. And since then, anarchism has profoundly influenced how I think and how I navigate the world. Aragorn has been kind of a pioneer of sorts, even though that sounds weird to say for an anarchist, I guess, when it comes to anarchism in South Africa, along with veganism. So he opened South Africa's first vegan restaurant, Earth 2.
I think I went there.
Oh, really?
Did you guys have tofu ice cream?
We definitely did.
Man, I was vegetarian, so I was like one of those annoying vegetarians that was like, oh, I'm so excited about a vegan restaurant, but like, I'm not going to actually look into veganism, you know, but that was amazing. Just
Better eat my eggs before I go in the door.
Yeah, so that was called Earth 2. And then later they opened a place next door that was kind of an info shop called Further, right?
Yeah.
And Aragorn is also a founding member of the South African Vegan Society and of the bolo'bolo Anarchist Collective. He's also contributed to a few publications like Why Don't the Poor Rise Up by AK Press and Anarchism and Animal Liberation Essays on Complementary Elements of Total Liberation by Anthony J. Nacella II. And even some of his own like Rights of the Nomads, which exists in zine format and I think in digital format too.
Yeah.
He's a collective member of the Institute of Critical Animal Studies Africa, ICAS. If any of you have been to the animal rights conferences at UCT, they put those on. He helps to organize the annual South Africa Deleuze and Guattari Studies Conference. He also spent 6 months traveling around the world collecting content to make a documentary about anarchism with a friend. And he is a co-owner of Contour Vinyl, lathe cutting vinyl business. He's actually also an experimental noise musician under the name Aragorn 23. And he helps to organize an annual festival of exploratory music and arts in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Oslo, Norway, called Edge of Wrong. So pretty much, Aragorn just does a shitload of stuff. Sometimes we even go running together. So Aragorn, welcome and happy to have you here.
Yeah, it's awesome to be with you guys.
welcome. Thanks for being here.
Is there anything that I left out of your intro?
That covers all the good stuff, I'm sure.
And your book? You just released a book?
Oh yes, you just released a book, which I didn't even include.
Yesterday.
Yeah, so my partner and I have been working on Deleuze studies for a long time. Gilles Deleuze is a sort of French philosopher from the second half of the 20th century. And as anarchists, we've been really interested in his thought because it maps really well to anarchism, even though him and his writing partner, Felix Guattari, never identified as anarchists. So we thought it'd be really nice to bring these two ideas together, Deleuze and anarchism, And we published an edited collection through Edinburgh University Press with a whole range of really interesting contributors from around the globe that were also seeing the intersection between these two things that had really been underexplored until now. So yeah, the book came out yesterday, available in all good online bookstores at hugely overinflated academic prices.
Yeah, I saw that.
$110,
Wow.
hopefully to be pirated soon.
Sounds super interesting.
Should we get into the interview?
Yeah. So Pete's pretty much covered a lot of it, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and how anarchism plays a role in how you live your daily life.
Okay. I think the best way to start with that would be to say that I've always identified as an anarchist. So I wasn't sort of that politically astute when I was a teenager, but I definitely experienced the world as being structured in a way that wasn't sort of necessarily in my interest, in the interests of my friends, and in the interests of most people around me. I mean, particularly growing up in apartheid South Africa, there was this deep sense that something was fundamentally wrong with society. But that it wasn't just sort of the structural racism of the apartheid era, but like just the fact that most people worked in these dead-end jobs that they hated, the sort of hyper-masculinity and just like ugly patriarchy of apartheid society. Not that any of that's disappeared now. But, all that stuff sort of influenced me to try explore what few ideas were available out there in the sort of pre-internet, sort of heavy censorship era. And the first things I sort of stumbled across that sort of described what the world was like and also what the world could be like that I really identified with were anarchist writings. Actually one of the first things I read on anarchism was John Zerzan's essay on agriculture, which is kind of the sort of far end of anarcho-primitivism. But I resonated really strongly with that and sort of like sought out a lot more anarchist ideas, which I found through music, through film, through other writings. And this stuff was very difficult back then because there wasn't a sort of abundance of information at all. If a friend of yours had this sort of scrappy third-hand zine in his back pocket and he was willing to lend it to you for a day, I mean, you'd sit and you'd handwrite the thing out onto scrap paper so you could have access to this. It was quite kind of tricky identifying politically as anything back then. And because of that, also my understanding of politics, my understanding of anarchism specifically was quite shallow for a while, and more a sort of intuitive sense about what I wanted to be and what I wanted to know more about. That's like probably 25 years ago or more.
Wow.
And I haven't really wavered in the interim. I've kind of just sort of learned more about it, and I've kind of tested it a lot, sort of regularly. I kind of constantly test my politics. Like, am I really fooling myself? Are there really not other possibilities? Is it just sort of like youthful naivety that draws me to this extreme politics that has these sort of like highly critical analyses of like everything around me? But yeah, I haven't found any good reason in that intervening period of like a quarter of a century to like really forego my politics or identify as anything else. So.
That is really interesting. And it makes me feel very like romantic about it, like reading third-hand zines and writing it out and stuff. So, but when and how exactly do you think you came across anarchism? Like, what do you remember? Like, when was the first? Like, how old were you, and what were you doing? And was there like this kind of spark, like, oh wow, anarchism, that you can remember?
So what's really weird is like a few years ago, I came across a zine that some friends and I put out. We had a series of zines in like the early 90s, and not like explicitly political zines or anything, just kind of weird counterculture stuff, because we were a bunch of really quirky middle-class suburban white kids who were really bored. So like we were trying to discover like the weirdest shit we could and then write about it and experiment with it and everything else. So we went to like weird psychedelics and bizarre music and the most experimental cinema we could find and everything else. And we'd publish zines about this stuff. And of course also like weird philosophy. So we were reading a lot of like the most edgy stuff we could get our hands on in that regard too. Like trying to find something that could explain our lives to us,
Yeah.
So I came across this zine and read this rant that I'd written age 17, which is like shamefully embarrassing, but where I was like identifying very strongly as an anarchist. But I can't remember at that time like what had influenced me. I mean, So there was that Zerzan essay, which was in a book called Apocalypse Culture, but which I think came later than that actually. So I don't know. I don't know what my first influences were. Maybe it was just like catching the bus home from nightclubs and like a bunch of punks at the back talking about anarchism in a sort of crusty punk kind of a way or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think explicitly when it became a sort of explicit self-identification that was based on some sort of actual knowledge of anarchist history and practice, probably the sort of late 90s, and that was probably from reading some of the classic anarchists, so Kropotkin, Bakunin, Proudhon, Emma Goldman, Malatesta, all this kind of stuff. Also from meeting a couple of other people who had started identifying as anarchists and were interested in kind of, seems weird to say, but doing it properly, you know, as opposed to just like having the aesthetic sort of entrapments of it. And actually trying to figure out how it could be applied, like how could we actually make it a meaningful part of our lives and carry forth some kind of anarchist practice into the world.
Sure.
So for those who are not super familiar with the kind of politics of anarchism, how would you define anarchism?
Oh, the big question.
Okay, so
No pressure.
I hope you have enough space on the hard drive to record this. It's really interesting. When we did our documentary, which was never released, we traveled around the world and we interviewed 100 odd anarchists from 4 continents.
Wow.
And asked them each the same kinds of questions you guys are chatting to me about now. It was interesting that was always the most difficult question for any of them to answer. So, you know, at some point in the interview, everyone got asked, like, what is anarchism? Explain it to someone who's never heard about it before. Explain it to your gran.
Yeah.
And people gave the most diverse and bizarre answers. And to me, that's something fascinating. And it says something about anarchism as a political philosophy. Because if you look at the roots of the term anarche, you know, in Greek, the etymological roots are without arche, without hierarchy. Right? So it's this sort of fundamental principle of anti-authoritarianism, of critiques of all relations of hierarchy and domination, where arrangement between individuals, be it 2 individuals or an entire society, is constructed hierarchically with above and below dynamics, as opposed to simply working out human relations together in egalitarian ways.
More horizontal kind of arrangement.
Yeah, so if you're thinking about it visually, it's a horizontal arrangement of society and of the various aspects of society, as opposed to a pyramidal or hierarchical one. So, I mean, historically, though, I mean, that's the sort of etymology of it, and that's the sort of abstract understanding of anarchism, anarche, against authority. But when you apply that to the actual world that you find yourself in, you're always confronted by a variety of sort of systems that exemplify those principles of authority. And when anarchism first emerged as an explicit political movement in the mid-1800s, with people like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, some of the people involved in the Paris Commune, Mikhail Bakunin, a lot of early Russian political radicals, there were very real sort of material conditions that they were encountering. The conditions of industrialization and the sort of like implementation of sort of full capitalism that came along with it, the tyranny of the state, and the sort of imposition of nation states and borders, and the wars of expansion and imperialism and colonialism that came along with those projects, the sort of hyper-patriarchy that was exemplified in different ways in different cultures and different times and places, but that has always been endemic to humanity. And yeah, even sort of the exploitation of the environment, which you see critiques of in early anarchists like Élisée Reclus. Early forms of anarchism, so these sort of people I just mentioned, and more importantly, the communities they form part of, because anarchism is not just this history of great white males or something, right? All these people were thinking in community, in sort of collective political projects. They just happened to be the people that wrote about it or did things that we remember. But unlike sort of authoritarian communism, which emerged around the same time, which is identified strongly with great men of history, which is why you get movements like Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, Marxism even, right? You don't get that with anarchism. No one calls themselves a Kropotkinite or a Bakuninist or a Emma Goldmanian, or, you know, it kind of feels absurd to talk about it in that way because it's always been this collective project. So anarchism started off when it was defined as this sort of explicit political project, being primarily a critique of capitalism and the state, and also organized religion, which was seen as deeply intertangled with the state. So Bakunin writes the seminal text, God and the State, where he sees them both as feeding the same principle of authority. And over time, that sort of has evolved to become more of a critique of hierarchy and domination in general. So there's more a sort of philosophical underpinning to anarchism nowadays, where you can kind of apply it to anything in the world you find around you. So it's not just the sort of large structural forms of oppression in society, but any sort of interaction, any sort of relation in society can be thought about in these ways. Like, is this authoritarian or not? Does this produce hierarchy and domination in the world, or does it mitigate it? Does it challenge it? And I think it's very useful in the sense that most other political philosophies, they have their sort of like bullet point list of these are the bad things in society, and this is our analysis. So like authoritarian communism, everything is capitalism, and everything else is reducible to, at the end, reducible to capitalist social relations. So we have a problem with patriarchy, we have a problem with structural racism, we have a problem with the state. All of this is actually just a result of capitalism for authoritarian communists, for Marxists. That's a really impoverished way of thinking about the world, because there's a lot of things in the world that predate capitalism, like patriarchy, like speciesism, that certainly don't have a direct relation to capitalism originally, even though they do now. And if your analytic lens is this like really impoverished one of like, here's my checklist and let me see where I can find capitalism in the social relation, it's not going to allow you to successfully understand the complexity of the world. So anarchism is uniquely equipped, I think, to allow us to analyze the world in its full complexity. It's constantly evolving. It allows itself to be fundamentally changed at any point. So anarchism itself, as a political philosophy, recursively applies this principle of anarchy. It challenges its own authority going forward. So if at any point a bunch of anarchists go, okay, cool, we've conclusively analyzed like all the forms of hierarchy and domination in the world, another anarchist will come along and say, no, hang on, what about the oppression of non-human animals? We haven't discussed that yet. That's also a form of hierarchy and domination. We need to expand our understanding of anarchism and expand the ways in which we seek to apply it to overcome all these forms of oppression in the world. So, yeah, I mean, the other way of thinking about it, which is useful when you sort of thinking about more liberal political philosophy, is that our conversations in the contemporary world about politics tend to involve these ideas of freedom and equality. And they're seen as these sort of mutually exclusive things, right? So if we want a sort of more neoliberal, capitalist, free market kind of society, then our fundamental social value is going to be freedom. And we're going to like react strongly against any move to ameliorate the excesses of that freedom, right? So freedom in that very limited sense of market freedom, of like, I want the freedom to be like rich and powerful and spend my money in a million different ways on a million varieties of the same boring crap. Don't you dare tax me more, because that's just oppression. That's just diminishing my freedom. Then you get more sort of socialist or social democratic or even communist societies, ranging from like China through to like social democracies like all the Scandinavian countries, where the idea of equality is much more highly socially valued. So, we want to make sure that everyone in society has a home, has enough food to eat, has free broadband if you're like living in Norway or something, these like really wealthy social democracies whose wealth often comes from very exploitative relations to elsewhere in the world, unfortunately, or from like fossil fuels or quite shitty things. But it's always seen as this kind of zero-sum game. We can sort of measure our freedom against our equality. We can have more of the one if we have less of the other. And anarchists have a totally different understanding of this idea. So there's this great quote from Bakunin where he says, my freedom is bound up in the freedom of all those around me. It's this necessary precondition. And I actually require the freedom of everyone else in order to fully express and enjoy my freedom, which makes a lot of sense. That equality is the sort of ground, the sort of fertile soil that nurtures our real capacity for freedom. And that the freer we are, the more capacity we have as human beings to really enrich that soil in return. So it's this sort of reciprocal relation between freedom and equality. And I think that's there's a philosopher, Saul Newman, an anarchist philosopher, who talks about this idea of equal liberty, this one word, equal liberty, which I think is another way of talking about this idea of freedom and equality as one concept. But it really makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're living in this sort of tooth and claw neoliberal society where everyone's trying to fuck everyone else over, and it's this like terrible race to the bottom, and everything that's like put out into the world for you to like consume or access is done in the worst way possible because someone wants to accumulate as much excess of it as possible, what kind of freedom do you really have? The freedom to like breathe in like shitty air, the freedom to eat like terrible poisonous food, the freedom to like watch everyone around you like slowly starve. I mean, neoliberal freedom is a really ugly idea of freedom. It's just the freedom to oppress and the freedom to exploit and the freedom to like not have any consequences, not bear any consequences for your actions in the world. Similarly, this idea of equality without freedom, you know, the whole 20th century demonstrated in all the sort of like communist projects, authoritarian communist projects, how enforced equality without individual freedom just leads to like the worst excesses as well, the worst excesses of abuse and oppression and conformity. And, you know, if you think about Mao's China, where they were literally going around like putting people into re-education camps because they had to learn Mao Zedong thought. You know, no other form of thought was allowed. I mean, when you don't even have the freedom to think and construct your own ideas, and if you do, they're deemed counter-revolutionary and you can be sent to a fucking gulag for them. That's terrifying. So each of these things in isolation are equally terrifying. They lead to like completely dystopian societies. The dystopia of like 20th century communist regimes and the dystopia of contemporary neoliberal regimes. And, you know, you get some societies kind of in between, like, you know, again, Scandinavian countries, which are a little bit better, but which are often only better because they're relying on the sort of externalities of exploitation. You know, if your economy is rich because you have a huge cell phone company that relies on coltan mined in the Congo, you know, that's kind of an ugly social democracy as well.
I was going to say, I mean, even countries like Denmark, for example, they'll like actually try and measure like gross national happiness. And I think it's such a weird way of understanding, because like you said, everybody's got housing and education, and there's like a human right to uncapped Wi-Fi, and like how can you possibly like measure happiness when there's, like you said, this counterbalance of like freedom versus equality? Very strange.
This idea of gross national happiness reminds me, it's like totally digression, but there's this really beautiful little documentary called The Other Cup, or The Other Final, that's what it's called. And it's about really sometime in the 90s. And it's the two worst national soccer teams in the world playing a match. It's Bhutan, who also measures they also measure gross national happiness. And I think some Caribbean team, I can't remember exactly which country it was, but they're two really terrible teams. But they sort of undermine the idea of success and winning and all this stuff within this little documentary. And it's actually like it challenges this notion of competition, both in sport and in life in general. But yeah, that idea of gross national happiness made me think of that. But also, if you're measuring the success of your nation in that way, first of all, you're assuming the nation, right? So it's easy to measure gross national happiness if there's gross international unhappiness. That's,
yes.
You know, a direct but implicit result of what you're doing. So this is also another thing about anarchism, is that it's always been internationalist, right? Anarchists are critics of the nation state, so they're also critics of borders and, you know, any kind of
flags, like
any kind of flags except the black flag, which is, you know, the anarchist symbol, the anti-flag.
Yeah. What about the vegan flag though?
Oh God.
Let's not even go there.
That's
That's
not-
a whole other
that's not-
episode.
But yeah, so anarchists are against anything that shuts down the free movement of people, because historically people have always moved freely. And the imposition of borders and walls and nation states is just a project of sort of power. It's a project of accumulation. It's a project that's against the interests of most of the people on the planet, and certainly most of the rest of the planet.
So if you had to define anarchism in like one sentence for someone, like one core principle that you just have to understand to even begin thinking about anarchism, what would it be? What would be like the one kind of guiding principle?
Can I give one sentence?
Yes, one sentence.
So anarchism has two projects, negative and positive, and the negative project is a critique of all relations of hierarchy and domination. The positive project is their replacement with a society of free equals, living in egalitarian internationalist ways, without borders, without states, without capitalism. Yeah.
Well done.
Beautifully stated.
Actually, I think a while ago we were having a conversation and you mentioned something about how, because anarchism is not really on the spectrum of politics, I think. This is not what you mentioned, but how I understand it is people are like, are you left or right? And they have this very like bi understanding of politics, but anarchism sits kind of post left, like off of the spectrum of politics, but also kind of we don't want to call it central because centrist politics are bullshit, and we all know that. But you mentioned that it was something like libertarian communism, which kind of fits into that equilibrity thing, right? Of how you have the libertarian understanding of leave me alone to do what I want without the like capitalist and nationalist shit that comes with that. And then the communist understanding of we should all be equal, but without the enforced and kind of government setup, right? So am I understanding that kind of correctly as well?
Yeah, this is very interesting as well because it brings up the question of how terms change over time. So when you look back at communism and you look back at Marx and people around that time, the idea of full communism was the idea of a stateless society. Marx wanted a society living in conditions of anarchy. He had very different views as to how to get there, and he had a very different analysis to the anarchists, some of whom he sort of participated in the First International with. So there were these sort of collective projects between the anarchists and the sort of more authoritarian communists at the time, and the split was around these sort of different analyses and different questions around the role of the state. But, communism originally meant pretty much the same as anarchy. It meant a stateless society, an anti-capitalist society. And over time, obviously, the term has become used more and more pejoratively because of like what happened in places like Soviet Russia, because of the Cold War and everything else. So now it's become a term of disparagement, and it's meant to refer to like really authoritarian, oppressive state regimes. So similarly, libertarian. Nowadays we think libertarian and we think like weird free market fundamentalists who call themselves classic liberals and like really the worst human beings, right? Libertarians, like right libertarians, it's like, young blonde men with like top hats who read Ludwig von Mises and
MAGA hats as well.
Yeah. And also think the world is like some city, or it's like a Lego block problem, Like, hey, I did first year philosophy and we learned about the trolley problem, and like the whole society is reducible to trolley problems or game theory or something like that, right? But libertarian was originally like another term for anarchism. So if you go to France now and you engage with people who call themselves libertarians, they're often people who are anarchists or anarchist communists or something. So there's this very interesting sense in which these terms change over time. And the same is also true of left and right. So, originally left and right, just from what I remember, it sort of was where you sat within parliament in sort of early French democratic systems or something. I'm terrible with history, but it's something like that, right? So it's quite an arbitrary identification. And over time, it's come to mean all the things that we commonly understand left and right to mean now. But it's also sort of given us an incredibly impoverished way to think about human possibility and political possibility, because as soon as you draw a little flat line on the ground and you say, here's the one pole and here's the other pole, and, just like a seesaw balances in the center, first of all, it gives you a completely false understanding, because whatever's at the center at any given point in time is not necessarily what should be at the center, right?
Yeah.
But a one-dimensional analysis of like the full possibility of human experience seems like incredibly limiting. So historically, anarchism is more on the left because it's more about like egalitarianism and overcoming capitalism and challenging a lot of the things that people on the left want to challenge, right? But obviously being anti-authoritarian, it doesn't agree with the methods of capturing the state and regulating the state. Some small Marxist-Leninist vanguard class regulating the state for the good of the workers, and then the state will magically wither away like it always didn't in the 20th century, right?
It always didn't.
Instead of turning into like a dystopian shithole where everyone was sent to gulags. But yeah, anarchism, I think, if you think about it in that way, adds another dimension to the analysis. Yeah. It says, well, we're not bound to this sort of like simplistic, or several more dimensions, right? We're not bound to simplistic left or right analysis with some inherently natural center that's inherently naturally good. We're not even bound to one of those silly political quadrants, right? Authoritarian, anti-authoritarian, left or right, like where are you on the little grid?
Yeah.
It's anarchism is much more about sort of what in philosophy you'd call an immanent philosophy. So as opposed to a transcendental philosophy, we have these pre-existing categories that are imposed on you, and that's just how the world is. Anarchism says, no, like the universe doesn't contain the categories of left and right as an inherent thing. We made that shit up, and we can make up other shit. And anarchism is all about making up that other shit. Those other political analyses that don't need to fall within that grid or that line at all in any way.
Yeah, so that's what I'm getting at, because like that's what kind of drew me in as well, because I've always been very frustrated at it seems like the majority of people's understandings of the world, actually. There's like left, right, Republican, Democrat, black, white, ANC, DA, you know, and it is like you mentioned that the center is seen as kind of like the best place to be. And then you do have centrist politics, which are like even sympathetic to like fascist people speaking and whatever. So it seems to kind of implode itself. And anarchism has always been like attractive to me in that way, because life is like so nuanced and gray, that to me it was so attractive to have this kind of way to understand those kind of things and not be bound by this simplistic thing. So maybe it's why people are so kind of scared of anarchism in a way, or they get put off by these radical politics because it's safer and easier to be in these like very clear boxes. You know what I mean?
I don't think people like to be challenged in general.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think this actually raises a really interesting point. I mean, first I want to say something, this idea of the center. I really like this notion that people have been using lately of the extreme center. It makes, think about it, it makes a lot of sense. The extreme center, right? We usually refer to the margins as the extremes, right? The extreme left, the extreme right.
Yeah.
When you think about the center, it tends to be whatever's dominant at that point in time. You know, your criteria for measuring what's moderate and what's radical is relative to whatever happens to be the case right now. And this is really obvious when you're talking about animal rights, right? Is the moderate perspective in terms of how we treat animals is the most extreme, insane fucking part of society, or one of the most extreme, insane parts of society. The vegan position is seen as really extreme, but that's just because the exploitation of non-human animals has occupied the center for so long and become the norm for the majority of the human population, or let's say at least the majority of the sort of mostly white, middle-class human population, because out of necessity, a lot of poorer people tend to nominally eat mostly plant-based diets. And,
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Or don't have the sort of like, you know, this fetish, patriarchally sort of informed fetish for like meat as part of their identity or whatever it is. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. But so when you extrapolate from that, you say, okay, well, in terms of veganism, we obviously understand that like the center is pretty fucking extreme.
Yeah.
Apply that to other parts of our social lives. Apply that to the political sphere. The center can be anything. The center can be Donald fucking Trump. You know,
That's a really good point.
It can be Bolsonaro. It's
Yeah.
so. Yeah, I mean, so I think we need different criteria, and that anarchism offers those different criteria, and it decenters things and says, well, but instead of just like trying to measure ourselves along the spectrum, why don't we just decide what we'd like life to be like? Create a context in which we can all have a meaningful say in what we'd like our life to be like. Because that's the underlying sort of principle, right? That we should all at least have a say. It's not this utopian blueprint like anarchism says the world must be like this. It's like we should all have a say in how the world looks. And most of us don't have a fucking say. You know, a bunch of capitalists and
What do you mean?
statists have a say. And
What do you mean? Every 4 years we can tick a box, Aaron. we all have a say.
We'll get to that.
But we should get to that. But this other thing that you raised about sort of people wanting to identify really rigidly with specific identities. I think it's always been the case that we're a social species, you know, we want to be with groups. We're willing to perform all sorts of rituals of inclusion and exclusion in order to maintain our belonging in these groups. You know, sociologists will talk about this. People who study subcultures as well. You know, hey, I'm part of this like specific musical subculture, so like I'm going to wear a certain like kind of fashion, and I'm going to express certain views on stuff, and I'm going to dance a certain way and whatever else. And a lot of that's just like performing our belonging. And it can be a positive thing. It's like, you know, it's like ritual in a way. You know, it's like, hey, like these are my people. Like,
Yeah.
It can also obviously go entirely the other way, and it can be leveraged by people with reactionary agendas, and people can start identifying with a bunch of creepy alt-right men's rights activists as their people. So we need to be very aware of these dynamics, this sort of drive for belonging and inclusion. That is something I think is exacerbated by several things in the contemporary world. The one is social media and the way in which the dynamics of social media interaction categorize us in very specific ways, right? First of all, when you're engaging with people online, it's an inherently public space. So you say something on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and it's like you feel like the eyes of the world are obviously there. You know, it's not a private space, not a space shared with like people who you necessarily closely identify with, that you're in solidarity with or feel safe around. It's this overexposure. In situations of overexposure, people tend to run to places of safety, right? They tend to identify very strongly with something and become unequivocal about it. Also, you know, it's a simple, mostly text-based medium where you're trying to summarize thoughts in a couple of lines or a couple of memes or whatever it is. And I think it's kind of polarized dialogue in these sort of very unsettling ways, where people identify more strongly these days with very regimented, very dogmatic positions because of the context in which they're identifying, because of that sort of public sphere of engagement. And I think this is having an effect on real social life. So I think, you know, it's an online phenomenon, but I think it seeps out into the real world. And it sort of influences how we even interact with each other in social spaces. You know, and I think the other thing that's sort of influenced this is just the complete erosion of all social ties under late capitalism, right? You know, the workplace has been replaced by various forms of precarious labor in the gig economy. Community life has been replaced by like the sprawl of the suburbs. All these things that traditionally formed sort of real senses of community are disappearing. And the right is leveraging this and presenting its own idea of community, which is aligned very much with these terrible ideas of like racial purity, masculinity, you know, horrible, horrible agendas. But it's something that people with more progressive agendas haven't caught up with yet. They're presenting things in very alienating ways that most people can't identify with and don't feel a communal bond with. So yeah, it's a really dangerous space where people are seeking to identify very strongly with reactionary and highly dogmatic points of view. And the only people sort of helping this out or recognizing the situation are people who don't mean well for anyone.
That's super interesting. I've actually never thought of it like that.
So do you think the problems that you're pointing out have something to do as well with this kind of inclination to freedom that we have, and in the way that freedom has been presented or mispresented to us by capitalism in this like hyper-individualist, anti-community way that is like, you said, like this is freedom, being able to be rich and spend money on what you want and climb this like bullshit ladder of capitalism, and that isolates us from each other. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It makes me think of like, so David Graeber, the anarchist anthropologist, who's also involved in Occupy and stuff like that, a really, really cool guy. He wrote this essay about the communism of everyday life. And he says that, you know, in our everyday interactions with the people around us, like we actually act like a bunch of anarchists. You know, if you're going to a friend's dinner party, there's not like the leader who's going to tell everyone what to bring to the dinner party and like,
you do dishes now.
Yeah, you do dishes now, and this is your task, and you can entertain us for 30 minutes. And, you know, and even in like, if you come from a relatively sort of functional family, families also those spaces. And even your interactions with strangers on the street, right? It's like, we tend naturally towards treating each other in egalitarian ways, you know.
Like uncoerced sharing and like fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when you're sitting around at someone's house and you're saying, hey, like let's go somewhere like to a party. It's not like one person's going to boss everyone else around. I mean, hopefully not. Otherwise, they're probably a bit of a shitty friend or just used to being like a bit bossy. But like you're probably all going to decide together. You can be like, okay, cool. Like, well, let's go watch a movie. Okay, what movie should we watch? Let's figure it out together.
Yeah.
So there's all these ways in which like our everyday life is, you know, and you don't charge your friends for dinner. Your friends come around to your house and you're like, hey, I'm making some dinner for everyone. You don't give them an invoice afterwards, right? So there's all these ways in which our everyday life is permeated by this very simple form of like everyday communism or everyday anarchy. And that, I think, is also the case with our desire for freedom, that we do naturally want to sort of be free and autonomous and express ourselves and explore ourselves and our sort of possibility. I keep using this term possibility because for me that's the most useful thing about anarchism, is it enhances our possibilities available to us individually and collectively. But I think what you're saying is really important, which is exactly that capitalism has found all these ways in which to divert our desires for these things, our natural proclivities towards these things, into these really sort of nasty ends. Like, cool, I know what your desires are, so here's what you're going to have to pay me in order to reach some sort of insipid pseudo version of the thing you really want.
Yeah.
So it sublimates our desires into these ugly things that just perpetuate a society that's actually against our interests in the long term.
Yeah.
I don't know if I actually agree that people have like a natural inclination towards freedom anymore. I think naturally we do, but like you say, as a kind of symptom of capitalism, I think people are terrified of freedom. When they're thinking in capitalist ways, nobody wants to actually make decisions for themselves anymore, the way I see it. It's like this fear of, if nobody's telling us what to do or nobody's making rules, how will we function? It's like this pseudo freedom that people are after. It's not freedom at all. They want to be told what to do. They want to be told what the rules are, and they want to be in those little boxes because it's easier and it's comfortable, and you don't have to think, and you don't have to be vulnerable, and you can just live up to these little bundles of social expectation where you can tick little boxes, and then you're good in life because you've done what you've been told. And I think that I agree that there's an inherent drive for freedom, but it gets crushed very soon.
Yeah, I think that we do have it in us, but maybe it comes from, did you say Buchanan did the original kind of state and church, state and God? So it's like this, how I understand it is, it's almost like this Calvinistic way that authority has made us live through fear and reward. So we are scared of freedom in that sense because there's no like coercion through fear or through reward, or it could be both. That's it's like, well, what if I do what I want and then get punished, and then what if I don't do what I don't want to do and then I can get rewarded? So I think people can't think outside of this, like almost I would say like Calvinistic capitalism in a way.
But I feel like the society we live in has stripped us so drastically of our own ways of thinking and our own desires that we're at this point where actual freedom is terrifying because nobody actually knows who they are anymore.
Or
they're just chasing little goals that have been established by society. I don't know.
But maybe it's also because we don't know what actual freedom even looks like.
This is a crucial point, right? So what I was going to say about this is most of us don't actually experience it enough in our everyday lives. And what was really powerful for me to see was, so when I was part of the collective that started bolo'bolo, the anarchist info shop in Cape Town a few years back, it was something we spontaneously decided to do. And the original collective was 4 of us, and then it sort of like expanded and shrank. And at some points there was sort of like 12 or 15 of us. And we had these collective meetings once a week to decide on how we wanted to make things happen in our space. And we were very committed to this idea that we have to reach consensus on everything, and everything's completely horizontal, and everyone gets to make decisions, and everyone's decision is equally regarded. So what was fascinating for me is that within that space, people who really weren't used to expressing their freedom were really unnerved by it at first and didn't know what to do, and they deferred to the authority of people who seemed like they had more natural authority within the space. And when that didn't work, and people realized they had to actually like claim some autonomy for themselves, it was really powerful. Like you saw people who had been like sitting in this sort of little shell for several weeks and not speaking up, suddenly reaching this threshold where like, oh fuck, actually, I can also decide on this shit. I also have a say in these things. And becoming sort of the most sort of active people in the group, and like really being sort of creative and expressing stuff that they'd never been able to express before. So for me, a vital part of my politics, if you can even call it politics, which is another thing which is worth talking about, but a vital part of my politics is providing the experience of anarchy, not just talking about it, not just publishing books about it, not just getting into online sort of debates with people about it, and not just participating in the more sort of tedious political aspect of it, marches and protests and all these kinds of things, but just creating everyday spaces where a different set of values are at play, and refusing to submit to the values that capitalism has inculcated in all of us, that the state has inculcated in all of us, that patriarchy and white supremacy have inculcated in all of us. It's a very difficult thing to practice, and people's natural tendencies to dominate and submit come out in these spaces at first. But if you navigate these spaces with care and with conviction, they can be very powerful for everyone involved. So I'm also thinking of another really interesting moment for me was when I first moved to Cape Town, so about like 8 or 9 years ago, whenever it was, when Occupy was happening. A bunch of us decided, we want to do an Occupy thing in Cape Town. And it was this really like loose network of people from very different spaces. And we decided to come together at this place called Community House in Salt River in Cape Town, which is used for a lot of political projects. And everyone arrived there. It's about like 100 people, but no one had really coordinated it. There was no one to defer to. There was no organizer as such. It was really weird. It just organically somehow come together with no one really organizing it. And so we get into this hall that we know is the space where we're going to be meeting. And there's a bunch of chairs piled up against the walls. And everyone just stands there. And eventually some people are like, but let's just put the chairs out. And they start putting the chairs out. And someone else says, no, but why are we facing all chairs forward? Let's put them in a circle. Then we put them in a circle. Then someone says like, okay, let's talk about stuff. How do we do that? And organically, a bunch of people a lot of whom had never experienced this kind of form of social interaction before, had created this consensus system and were like freely expressing themselves and creating something really beautiful and dynamic. Then this bunch of like old Trotskyists walked in, told everyone to turn their chairs forward, put a whiteboard down and said, okay, the meeting has started. Fucked everything up completely. So it was such an interesting thing to see, though, that people do have this natural tendency when unrestrained, but it's a tendency that requires practice. It has to be applied.
I remember a similar thing happened the one time when we did a Food Not Bombs in that park and observatory, when we had this very like, here's the table with the food, everybody line up and come get the food. And then we decided, well, anybody can dish. And then also the way that we would sit would be kind of like in a circle. And it was like, you could tell everybody was hesitant and confused at first, but it did create these like very meaningful interactions with the community, because for those who don't know, the point of Food Not Bombs is to kind of blur class divide. And it's about solidarity and not this like kind of top-down charity thing. So you had people from all groups, even like private security guards that arrived sitting in a circle, chatting, sharing the same food. And it was cool to see that like every day, like this organic kind of flourishing of essentially anarchism happening. So
yeah, exactly. And I think once people begin to feel empowered in that way, they start also feeling empowered to ask questions like, why doesn't more of my life look like this? What's stopping me? And also what's stopping all the people around me, especially people who aren't necessarily as structurally privileged as me, from also like enjoying more autonomy in their lives and also feeling more empowered in their lives. And as soon as you start asking those questions, you run up against, the laundry list of shit that we're all against, right?
Yeah.
So back to very, very basic, simple
stuff.
Where does the Circle A come from?
So it's really interesting. When you guys sent me the original bunch of questions that you were going to ask.
We didn't do that. This is all natural.
This is totally organic.
Live, man. I'm not reading from a piece of paper. There's no teleprompter. I'm not being paid anything for this. Can I get some
You're
tofu?
really
off?
not.
Some tofu, sure.
I didn't know. So I was like, let me go Google this. And there's no actual conclusive story on Google about the origin of the Circle A. I mean, some people talk about the punk movements, the bands like Crass, like the narco-punks of the late 70s. I know it's older than that. I think Don may have even used it, but I mean, I'm terrible with anarchist history and history in general. Like, I really struggle with the cold hard facts of the stuff. I'm much more into sort of retaining the ideas, extracting the essence of the ideas, and then forgetting all the detail, which can be bad sometimes. I once thought Auschwitz was in Germany, and just,
A lot of people think Auschwitz is in Germany.
Yeah, but it's that kind of stuff, it's like weird basic stuff that people should know. And who's the president? What year is this? But yeah, I don't know where it originally comes from. But I mean, anarchists have developed a variety of really interesting symbols over time. And the circle A is cool. And I like these sort of marks of identification. It's really nice if you're in a new place and you're wandering around and you see someone with like a shirt or a tattoo or something. You can be like, oh, fuck, I found my people, you know? Or eating a block of tofu. But
how often do you encounter that? People just eating blocks of tofu.
Of raw tofu, uncooked.
So I'm just obsessed with tofu at the moment because like I went to the health shop yesterday and the tofu had expired and they gave it all to me for free.
Oh, that's
So I have a
amazing.
fridge with like all this tofu and it's not expired. It's fine. But for me, the best symbol is the black flag. You know, because historically flags, I mean, as Arundhati Roy says, you know, flags are meant first to rally people to war and then to like wrap the dead, you know. It's something like she says it better than that though. The black flag is the sort of anti-flag, it's the antithesis of flags representing nation-state projects and projects of this sort of like exclusive belonging. You know, it's inherently internationalist. It's the absence of any specific identity. There's a really, really beautiful thing written by an old anarchist. He passed away a few years ago, Howard Ehrlich. He was the editor of this journal, Social Anarchy, and he wrote a book called Reinventing Anarchy. He wrote this incredible thing, Why is Our Flag Black?, which is really worth Googling. You know, just talking about how black is the color of possibility. It's like the blank canvas, right? Nothing on it yet. And everything comes from darkness originally. Everything comes from like, you know, the birth of the universe, like the sort of abundance of darkness that precedes anything, any emergence into form. Yeah. So for me, the black flag is this really beautiful thing.
I guess it's, I mean, it's probably older, but you know how like pirates, this like romantic myth of pirates using the black flag, they never associated with any nation. The flag, I mean, well, the skull and crossbones, obviously that's irrelevant, but I've read that people say it's like kind of the combination of all flags would like make black. You know what I mean? And does it have anything to do with pirates, or is that just a silly?
Well, there's really, I mean, if you move beyond the sort of popular reading of piracy, and you read sort of more radical histories of pirates, I mean, they were scary a lot of the time, but they're also like very utopian. There's actually a couple of books on sort of pirate utopias, and it's people who are inherently internationalist, very anti-xenophobic, anti-state, anti-capitalist in the sense that in this Robin Hood kind of vibe, you know, like
steal from the rich.
Yeah. Steal for the rich and keep for ourselves. But yeah, there's a really utopian aspect to piracy, to the original idea of pirates, which is carried through into the contemporary era, where you look at sort of digital piracy and the ethos of a lot of people involved in digital piracy, which is all about the Creative Commons and, you know, sharing stuff for the collective good of humanity and
I mean, like
private property and all that kind of stuff.
Like those groups that make academic papers free.
Yeah.
When like it's actually a very privileged thing normally because you have to pay so much money just to like unlock one. So I guess that's similar.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would never do that with my $110 book. It's not going to be on arg.fail at all.
But so I also read about the A symbol. I mean, most likely it's just like the A of anarchism with the border that became this like circle A. But I think people also have this misunderstanding, which is what was my first introduction to anarchism, through the punk rock movement of anarchy means I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want and just run around like a drunk idiot and treat people like shit. And I think a lot of people have that understanding of anarchism from the surface view that the media presents, or this idea of anarchists are just people throwing Molotov cocktails in balaclavas. And like this idea of it's chaos. It's just like pure chaos and it could never work because people would just be out of their minds, out of control. And what I read was that the circle around the A is actually an O for organization. And it's like it's like this like kind of ultimate form of organization, because I think to have any kind of successful anarchist community, you would have to be very good at organizing and work out how to organize together. So that was what I once read, could have been in a crusty zine or something, but that it's actually exactly the opposite of what people think of this kind of disorganized chaos, and actually it's like very organized
Yeah.
around anarchism.
There's a whole book to be written on crusty zine wisdom. It's like, back in the 80s before we could like fact check shit.
Yeah.
I remember that at my first vegan restaurant, the chef there, like an old crust punk guy, really awesome guy. And he was super like into these like this crusty zine wisdom. And some of it was just way out there. It's like, oh my God, I hope people still don't try that stuff. But yeah, I mean, so I think is it Proudhon or is it Alexander Berkman who talks about how anarchy is order, right? But it's enhanced kind of order. It's an order that emerges from the complexity of society and the natural world. So, I mean, there was this stupid thing where the punk scene associated anarchy, most famously because of like the Sex Pistols and stuff, with chaos and disorder. But then you also have the anarcho-punk scene, Crass most notably, who were explicitly anarchist and pro-animal liberation and stuff like that, who did a lot to actually popularize the real ideas of it. But I think, it's almost like it was a permissive thing, not an entirely bad thing. It was a kind of a permissive outlet saying, fuck it, fuck the order and the restraints of society. We want to let loose a little bit. Here's a context in which we can do that. And hey, if maybe like 10% of the people who got into that actually went a bit further than the like, let's get drunk and like smash shit up, then that's actually cool as well. Like, because I know a lot of people who are like really solid anarchists nowadays who really understand the theory and practice and stuff and have been really active, who also got into it through the punk scene. So just like the vegan and animal rights liberation scenes, like the punk movement, the early punk movement influenced them a lot. The punk scene nowadays definitely not, because it's a kind of terrible reactionary space mostly. But on the other hand, like, I do think that the idea of chaos is an appealing one, not in the sort of everyday pejorative sense of like, oh my God, it was just chaos, people like smash shit up and like set shit on fire, and there can be very valid reasons for doing all those things. Setting a bank on fire is an act of collective empowerment, saying these institutions are not transcendental, they don't have infinite power, we can actually disrupt their functioning. That is really collectively empowering, which is what the black bloc tactic is about, for instance. But chaos in the sense of scientific chaos, mathematical chaos. We live in a world comprised of various intersecting chaotic complex systems that exhibit non-linearity and bifurcations and tendencies to emerge in unexpected ways. I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about the world and about human possibility within the world, is that we are living at the intersection of numerous really complex systems. And as soon as we start imposing sort of strict linear grids and taxonomies and orders onto that, we're doing an injustice to what the world's really like, and an injustice to ourselves by extension, right? Because then we start thinking about ourselves in these simple, linear, categorized ways. This is X, this is not X. So yeah, the philosophical idea of anarchy being an acknowledgement and participation in the complexity of the world, I think is really useful.
Okay, so anarchism has the black flag, which I think you explained really well. What about the flags that you sometimes see that are kind of the diagonal half colors of like red, purple, green? What do those mean?
Yeah, so I think that's it's kind of fun in a way, that anarchists have created these like numerous sort of symbols and all these different colored flags. You get the red and black, the purple and black, the pink and black, the green and black, the brown and black, the like, very obscure ones. Not the yellow and black. That's some terrible like right libertarian edgelords who want to identify as anarchists because just being free market fundamentalists doesn't sound as cool.
Okay, so for those who...
So anarcho-capitalism, not a real thing.
Yeah,
but
avoid the yellow and black flag.
Yeah. Looks suspiciously like urine.
Although brown and black is not the best aesthetically pleasing color combo.
I don't even remember what that is, but someone came up with a brown and black one at some point. But yeah, so the flag thing represents sort of different tendencies within anarchism. So red and black is anarchist communists. Purple and black, anarcho-feminism. Pink and black, queer anarchism. Green and black, green anarchy, or anarcho-primitivism sometimes. So anarchists tend to identify with projects or practices, like instead of, as I said earlier, with famous people. So anarchist communism, anarchist syndicalism, insurrectionary anarchism, these are all different tactics. And some people that identify almost exclusively with a single tactic. So you'll get people who say, I am an insurrectionary anarchist. That's what I am. Insurrection is the way to go. We don't need organization, blah, 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 blah. Or I'm an individualist anarchist, and that's what I am. We don't need society. Society is a specter. This is Max Stirner. It's like an early sort of proto-anarchist who has this idea of like everything being a sort of specter, some abstraction that imposes itself on our capacity for freedom. But as crime thinks say, I think really astutely, they just represent different contexts we find ourselves in, right? So if I'm in my community and we're figuring out a collective meal, I'm an anarchist communist. If I'm in the workplace and we're engaging in a worker struggle against labor exploitation, I'm a syndicalist. If I'm out in nature with some friends hiking, we're green anarchists. So for me, the flags, they always look best together. At bolo'bolo, we hung them all, as many as we could find. In fact, my friend Amantha made most of them for us, I think. We hung them all over the walls, and it was really lovely to see them all together. And this idea that we have different strategies and tactics that are sort of highly contextually bound, but that we want our practices to represent the full range of social life, We don't just want to focus on like mountaintop removal and extractive mining practices. We don't just want to focus on labor struggles in the workplace. We don't just want to focus on how our personal subjectivity is being oppressed by all these abstractions. They're all valid parts. They all need to intersect in a meaningful, comprehensive anarchist practice.
Do you not think that there's a chance, this is the way that I the assumption that I made when I first became aware of the multiple flags, that, we're living in a very problematic society. So it's all fair and well to say, okay, we have a black flag. This represents equality and freedom and all of these great things. But you are still coming from a place where people who might be new to anarchism come with a whole lot of baggage from the society that we live in. So it might sound nice to kind of adopt anarchism as this political viewpoint, but it might be, for example, a guy who's coming from society, a capitalist society and a patriarchal society, and thinking, oh, I identify with this, I'm an anarchist now, not realizing that he still has a lot of like patriarchal problematic views. So the way I kind of saw the multiple flags was perhaps a group of anarchists realizing that no kind of political movement or any kind of movement is perfect, and there are problematic people within. So I see it more as kind of highlighting the need to say, don't forget about these issues within this framework. There shouldn't be a need for things like feminist veganism, but there is a need because there's a lot of vegans who are not feminist. So my kind of take on it was, there shouldn't be a need for any of these multiple flags, but maybe there is, because people don't always get it. Don't forget that you should also be feminist. You should also, maybe it's a simplistic view, but that's kind of how I see it.
I like that.
Because I've heard of even organizations shutting down any dialogue, even anarchist organizations shutting down any dialogue brought up about feminism, for example, because they're like super syndicalist, worker focused. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that happens a lot. I don't like flags, even black ones, but if I do identify with a flag, it's, it doesn't have any lines down the middle, because I do think people who identify too strongly with any one of the specific tactics or strains within anarchism, they tend to do so at the exclusion of the whole. Like very workerist syndicalists or any one of them, right? Who just exclude everyone else's struggles and don't recognize the intersection, right? And intersectionality applied radically is a critical part of anarchism, right? We all come with our inherited cultural, social baggage. We all manifest that in the spaces we try to navigate, even the radical ones where we're trying to overcome forms of hierarchy and domination in society. So I really like this idea that they're reminders of crucial things that we have to address. It reminds me of sort of one of the largest historical anarchist movements was Spain in 1936, where anarchists sort of ran large parts of the country during the Civil War until they got fucked over by a whole bunch of factors. But so you had all these sort of mostly anarchist men out fighting against like different fascist forces and everything else, and also trying to run the workplaces and run the communities and run the trams, which they did better than the capitalists had, and productivity was increased and all these wonderful things. But you also had the emergence of a group called Mujeres Libres, Free Women of Spain, who were raising this issue early on, like, hey, you can't have this wonderful anarchist utopia if you still have these like shitty patriarchal oppressive relationships towards women, and like women are supposed to stay home and do the cooking and mind the kids while you're out like struggling for the revolution. Yeah, I mean, that's really ugly. And I think nowadays it's, fortunately, in most contexts, in most anarchist contexts, you can't get away with that kind of shit anymore. So I think someone coming in for the first time saying, hey, I identify as an anarchist, but I'm like actually a shitty oppressive patriarch. I think as soon as they try to participate in a community, in any sort of collective project, they'd be confronted about it very quickly. Like, hey, you can't. And this happened, I mean, even in bolo'bolo, even in the collective space I was part of in Cape Town, that would often happen during our meetings. People would be called out on stuff in good ways, in constructive ways, not in, not
get out, shut up and get out.
Yeah, not just in the shitty ways we see with sort of more liberal identity politics, where it's just about like sort of gaining cultural capital by consuming everyone around you, but in good ways, like, hey, like, dude, that was a pretty shitty patriarchal thing to do. Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out.
But I mean, there is obviously a chance, like you spoke earlier about like finding your people, I would assume there's a chance that these pockets could form of people who are very closely aligned in their views and therefore can perpetuate problematic ideas within a largely unproblematic way of thinking. So there's a possibility that there could be this entire group of people who don't even see that there's like patriarchal thinking going on. And I don't know, my kind of assumption would be that those flags would have come out of something like that, where there was a group that encountered a group of people like that, where something had to be said.
Yeah, so like the Spain example.
Exactly.
Like I said, you had these people who are like, we are anarchists, and then maybe the women came up with these like this purple and black flag that's like, hey.
Yeah, you're forgetting about us. So,
or
maybe
or queer anarchism, right? Where it's like, hey, there's a whole bunch of gender essentialism and transphobia going on here. Like, this needs to be addressed. Or even, with people like Murray Bookchin, sort of, I mean, there were actually anarchists right back to the 1890s who were concerned about environmental questions. But people like Murray Bookchin in the 50s and 60s starting to make environmental questions part of the anarchist milieu, which had also been something that had been overlooked. It was all about like worker struggles, and once we have the means of production and we can like industrially develop for the good of society, blah, 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 that totally ignores the question of like, well, what are we developing and what kinds of industrial and technological infrastructure are we setting up, and what is its impact on the natural world? So yeah, I think you're right. I think they do emerge in that context of like, hang on, like our understanding of, and again, that's then this lovely idea of anarchism being inherently sort of infinitely expandable, right? There's an infinite amount of colors we can choose from. And who knows, 20 years from now, maybe there'll be 100 different flags, and it'll be like, oh my God, look how much we fucking overlooked in 2019.
Yeah.
Our anarchism was so primitive then. It was so like focused on like a little handful of issues, and look how many other things we weren't even aware of.
And then hopefully it'll just get back to one single black flag, because everyone just gets how not to be shit.
And then when we achieve that, we'll burn that one too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's that great thing in that Crime Think zine.
Yeah.
It's a quote from Jean Genet.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're going to need the black flags in order to win, but we must be sure to burn them all afterwards.
Yeah, I love that.
What would you say in summary is the main problem with the way society is structured? We've kind of discussed oppression and things like that, but why is there an urgency to consider anarchism, would you say?
So I think there is a great urgency all around us, coming from sort of every aspect of life, right? The sort of abject poverty that capitalism has created, the expanding sort of decimation of the natural world, the exploitation of countless billions of other animals. Most of the world's population living in conditions close to sort of complete immiseration, actually. Whatever sort of mythical narratives are promoted by like middle-class intellectuals, pseudo-intellectuals, actually, like Steven Pinker and Sam Harris and people like this. Things aren't getting better. Things are getting worse in a lot of really visceral ways for a lot of people. But I think your sense of urgency is going to be defined based on where you find yourself. If you find yourself in a nice little shiny white middle class enclave in a relatively so-called developed country, you're probably not going to feel a great urgency, because the whole world is telling you that things are okay and things are getting better. You're participating in the sort of narrative of societal progress and technological advancement, and isn't democracy wonderful?
Yeah, look at Elon Musk and what he's making.
Yeah, exactly, right? Elon Musk is like the sort of noble myth of like where we're all headed. what a fucking terrible nightmare dystopia. But like, you know, for most of the world, the sense of urgency is long-standing and endemic and emerges naturally from the conditions that most people wake up finding themselves in every day of their lives. Where if they're lucky, they're working a fucking shitty job they don't like, that maybe puts enough bread on the table to feed them and their family. Where they have no access to 99% of the stuff that wealthy people in developed countries have access to. And where it's pretty obvious that like the entire natural world is collapsing all around us. So there's this really interesting book I read recently called A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None by Catherine Yusoff. It's a short little book and you can get it for free online. It was released with like an open source license, which is, I think, is a really cool thing. And she talks about this idea that, you know, this idea of the Anthropocene, that we're in a new sort of geological epoch, has now become sort of this commonplace idea in like sort of white middle class society. Oh my God, we fucked up the natural world so much and we're such a dominant force within it that we're now changing the very sort of environment, the climate, we're shifting the geology of the earth. And she says like, well, you know, the crisis that we find ourselves in now, and the sense of urgency that we're starting to feel about this, colonized and indigenous people have been feeling this for 500 plus years. That the Anthropocene is something that every indigenous person who's been the victim of colonization has experienced and knows full well about, and is better situated to articulate than we are. Because, you know, when a bunch of fucking colonists arrived in a land that wasn't theirs and started putting up flags and like enclosing the commons and like demarcating things off as property and forcing people into labor for them, that was a complete alienation from the natural world. That was the Anthropocene. That's the complete collapse of your entire sort of existential reality, right? So I think this question of urgency, if people aren't feeling urgency, they're not listening, they're not paying attention. And I think it's an incredibly privileged position to be in, that you can live your everyday life without this deep sense of dread and urgency. And yeah, I think people need to listen harder and need to challenge themselves on going out and finding people who are speaking about this stuff and finding context in which this stuff is being meaningfully explored and honestly and critically explored. Because there is a great urgency. And the more of us start feeling this, the more we can actually meaningfully do to contribute towards overcoming it.
That was a really good answer.
Really good points.
Earlier you mentioned, for example, smashing banks can be like a kind of liberatory thing. And I think a lot of people, especially like the white middle class, see a lot of anarchist actions as violent. And I've personally been very interested in this idea of violence because like reading, for example, The Failure of Nonviolence by Peter Gelderloos, he talks about giving over 500 workshops on violence, and never in one have people reach consensus on a definition of it. And so I think a lot of people who are into this like pacifist love will win kind of ideology, or you could even say dogma, because people are not really open to diversity of tactics in general. They see, for example, would see smashing a bank as a violent act. But how do like anarchists think about violence, and what is violent and not violent, and is it even a relevant question to be asking?
Yeah. It's a hugely interesting question, and I think Gelderloos is one of the people that really deals with it well. Also, Ward Churchill, Pacifism as Pathology, is a really important book on this. But, you know, both of them, what they do is they look at the history of sort of radical social justice movements and how there was always actually physical action or violence, or however you choose to define it, because violence is a pretty useless term, actually. It's so broadly defined as to be almost useless. But that there's this myth parroted of how like every successful movement for social change used nonviolent means. But that's bullshit. You know, when you look at it, Martin Luther King didn't magically create civil rights. He had the fucking Black Panthers around at the same time. The suffragettes were bombing people, you know, like Gandhi and India. Like you also had like radical resistance movements, and Gandhi was the compromise so that shit didn't get totally out of hand. So, well, I mean, these guys write about it really well, but they demonstrate how like this entire, I mean, and in South Africa, we know this as well. You know, Mkhonto Wesizwe was like an underground armed resistance movement that was a really pivotal part in like the struggle.
And why Mandela got where he was.
Yeah, and this idea of Mandela as this like sort of Gandhi-esque figure. Like, no, he was full on for like if we need armed struggle, we need armed struggle. Rightly so. So we tend to view violence only interpersonally in our society because of the fact that sort of capitalist existential reality, the way capitalism forces us to kind of think about ourselves and think about the world we find ourselves in, is all intersubjective. It's all me and you, and everything's between individuals. And if something bad happens, it's just another person treating you badly. We're very bad within capitalist society at looking at the structural forces that condition us. So there are all sorts of forms of what could really sort of reasonably be called structural violence that define our sort of everyday lives. And structural violence, the capitalism of the state, of white supremacy, patriarchy, everything else. People experience real physical pain and real physical harm and psychological harm from these structural forms of violence. We just struggle a lot to articulate them, and because of that, it's harder to really mobilize against them because people don't understand what you're talking about when you talk about structural racism. Because we're used to understanding racism as like, you called me a shitty name.
Yeah.
And there are much more insidious forms of these things in the world. So if that stuff is all violence, and if someone punching someone in a bar fight is violence, and if throwing a rock through a window is violence, and if swearing at someone is violence, it's a fucking useless term, right? Yeah. All we need to talk about is what was the action? Was it aimed in the direction of justice and did it achieve justice? Or did it reinforce shitty, oppressive, hierarchical, dominating behavior? So, what is her name? Patrice Jones writes this really beautiful thing called The Turtle Talk. And she asks us to consider the scenario in which there's a child living with the father and the father is abusing the child. And the father pushes the child down the stairs one day. I'm probably getting the story wrong, but this is the gist of it. And that's a violent act. It's this shitty, abusive dad like pushing his daughter down the stairs. And we all understand that as violence. Then one day the father comes home drunk and he's standing at the top of the stairs. And the daughter realizes that by pulling the rug out from under his feet at that moment, she can send him tumbling down the stairs to his death. Is that violence? So, yeah.
The thing that got me thinking about it are the numerous ways in which actually media portray violence. Like, you get a slaughterhouse killing millions of animals every month that gets an arsonist burns it down. So, like, some people lose their jobs, but they aren't killing millions of animals. So what's the most violent act? Or, like, for example, in the recent G20 summits, was it G20 where Trump used the term professional anarchists?
Yeah.
For the thousands of anarchists that organize themselves in Hamburg in Germany. I will walk down that street where like all these squats are, and they destroyed all of the banks. But you can tell what shops they left alone and what shops and banks they destroyed on purpose. But the way the media portrayed it was this like just fucking wild, destroy everything chaos, when actually it was very systematically and very intentional.
Yeah.
And so is smashing a bank and burning a bank down violence, or is, like, for example, in Kailicha, police vans driving over people's houses violence? You know what I mean? And it's just the way I think it's portrayed and people understand violence that got me so interested in this idea of, like, what is violence and why do we have to be, like, have this dogmatic, like, non-violence is the only thing that works, love will fix everything. So that's why I kind of asked, like, you know, what do anarchists think in general?
Yeah.
But I agree with you. It's kind of like a useless term.
Yeah, I mean, so I think a good thought exercise is always to consciously avoid the use of the term violence when we speak about these things. Use other language. It's a lazy practice we've all fallen into, amplified by, like, a lazy media as well, really. But when we start talking about these things without using the term violence or any similar terms, then all the nuances and singularities of each actually come through. Because if you can't use the term violence to talk about anarchists in Hamburg smashing bank windows, then we actually need to talk about more substantial ideas of why would an anarchist break a bank window, and what does that bank window represent? And this is one of the reasons why I find the philosopher Deleuze so close to anarchism for me is because he asks this question. He says, like, we don't want to know what things are. We don't want this essentialist sort of idea of like, this is that, you know, it needs a label on it. Instead, let's ask what things do. You know, what are the outcomes of things? What happened? So this for me is really useful as well, because when you talk about it in that sense of what happened, what did the anarchists do in Hamburg? You get very different answers to, was it violence or not?
Well, on a kind of related note, another kind of seemingly common misconception is that if anarchy was realized, like worldwide, there would be nothing stopping people from murdering and robbing each other and just completely violating each other's rights. But anarchism obviously focuses on individual autonomy and freedom and necessitates the respect for the freedom of others, right? So how would you explain anarchist views on the inherent nature of people? Why would society not erupt into a chaotic bloodbath? Do you think that there's something inherent in people that would stop that, or that would, you know, create that kind of violent chaos?
Yeah. So I love these questions of, you know, but in an anarchist society, wouldn't people fuck each other over all the time? They always come from this like kind of vacuum where it's like you're not in the current world. It's like, but hang on, people are doing that now.
Yeah.
It's like, what would prevent environmental destruction in anarchist world? Like, well, we kind of have that now. So on the one hand, all the shit is endemic, and it's endemic because of the structural conditions that we live under, right? So a lot of the interpersonal violence and structural violence we experience, to use that shitty term, is the direct result of capitalism and states and patriarchy and white supremacy and speciesism and everything else and all the things we want to get rid of, right? So when you look at how shitty behavior that causes harm to people is treated in current society, it's often rewarded. The very worst exploiters, the most oppressive, horrible human beings, most sociopathic individuals and groups tend to accumulate a lot of power, right? And that's because the world has been structured in this way. So if what we want is something that addresses all these things that give rise to all this stuff that causes such great harm, on the one hand, we've diminished most of the possibility for it occurring, right? So in a society where there's far less incentive for someone to achieve power over someone else, or far less incentive for them to pollute because they're directly affected by it, or any of these kinds of things, or far less incentive for them to oppress their neighbors because their neighbors are going to boot them out of the fucking community, you'll see far less of this behavior. Also, when people feel more empowered and they're leading more sort of rich and fulfilling lives, you know, they're going to be psychologically and physically healthier. And a lot of the sort of interpersonal harm that comes from just being sick because of the society you live in, and physically sick from the society you live in, that you tend to manifest outwards onto other people, a lot of that just disappears automatically, right? So the other thing that's important is that an anarchist society isn't one that would be sort of finally set in stone for all time. So if something shitty emerged within anarchist society, those sort of tools, the anarchist tools of like constant reinvention, would be there to be able to respond to that. Like, oh shit, we've got this like really egalitarian utopian space that we've created and everyone's treating each other nice, but like those people over there are being shits and they're exhibiting oppressive behavior. We can figure this out. We can create fresh new ideas to figure this out, because it's not like we're bound to some set of eternal laws and principles that have already dictated how we deal with those situations. We can come up with new responses to situations. So it's this, again, Deleuze speaks about, instead of the idea of law as this eternal perennial force that's always the same and unchanging through time and always imposed from the top, we have jurisprudence, which is situated and thinks about each encounter individually and comes up with novel ways in which we can deal with the uniqueness of each experience. So, I mean, the simple answer is, on the one hand, anarchism would take away a lot of the incentive for people treating each other badly. And on the other hand, anarchism would allow us to come up with better ways all the time of trying to deal with those instances where that stuff did happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as if we all have this burning desire to go out and kill people and act violently, to use the term again, and the only thing that's stopping us is law. But like, I have no desire to go and murder people right now. It's not like if there was an anarchist society, suddenly I'd be like, yes, I can kill people.
Finally.
I think that actually comes from, again, this Calvinistic religious like intermeshing of capitalism and oppression. Because not only is it about law, but also morals. And I remember, for those who have heard of Aragorn, it's very likely you've seen him arguing online. But I was having this conversation with this person who was pretty religious about morals being subjective. And one thing that you said has always really stuck to me, that all of our morals and values and belief inform and are informed by our other morals and values and beliefs. And so you are a very problematic person who should probably go see someone if your objective morality not being around meant that you were going to go just run around and murder everybody. That's not what we would be like in an anarchist society, and most likely you wouldn't be part of it if that was how you were going to be without your moral law, so to say.
Yeah. I mean, it's really simple when you think about it. In our current society, most of the people who treat each other really fucking badly, the worst, nastiest human beings, you can trace it back to how they were brought up and the kind of struggles they faced growing up and everything else. Shitty contexts make shitty people. So if you instead want a society where we like empowering and nurturing each other and creating this really like sort of egalitarian context for each other, people are going to grow up less shitty. They're going to have less resentment and hatred and animosity towards each other. They're going to have less of a desire to scramble for power over each other. But it's also interesting to observe what happens when conditions close to anarchy happen in the contemporary world, right? So if there's a crisis, for instance, there's this author, Rebecca Solnit, who speaks about this. She wrote this really great book, A Paradise Built in Hell. So she looks at what happens when, for instance, there were the floods in New Orleans and thousands of people were displaced, and the Red Cross and all these sort of major sort of relief organizations were very slow getting there because it was mostly poor people, and who the fuck cares, right? And this was like the stereotype of, these people are going to just go out. These people, of course, are just going to go out and like loot and pillage and like violently assault each other. But instead what happened is people helped each other rebuild their homes, and they made sure everyone had food, and they developed these like sort of spontaneous sort of community organizations to like help figure shit out and help like overcome their situation. And this idea of mutual aid and solidarity, I mean, the anarchist Kropotkin says this is what you see in most of the natural world as well, right? This stupid social Darwinist tooth and claw idea that it's all about like asserting power out in the wild. This doesn't really happen. What happens a lot more is social species and even collaboration between species. And, the idea that we're all kind of in this together. And in the human world where you see people treating each other really badly, you can probably find some or other structure of hierarchy and domination that's deeply influenced that behavior. Whereas when people are just like the victims of something beyond their control and they need to band together and figure it out collectively, they tend to do that. They're not like jumping up behind each other and slitting each other's throats.
Yeah, I think you made a good point earlier as well about, a lot of the shittiest behavior in society coming from those capitalist structures where, you are rewarded for being shitty, essentially. But I think there's also a lot to be said for relative deprivation, where you have people at the other end of the spectrum who are really suffering at the hands of the society and, acting in these so-called problematic ways where they are acting out of a space of being disempowered, where you have your neighbor in a fancy mansion and everything's all peachy and you don't even know what you're going to eat that day. Of course you're going to build up frustration. Of course that might manifest in some kind of violent crime or behavior, and that wouldn't be there if everyone just had what they needed.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at just how fucked an unequal society is, especially our society, especially South African society, the most unequal society in the world by so many measures. The fact that every single fucking human being living in a Camps Bay mansion hasn't been fucking hung out to dry by now exemplifies the fact that we're actually pretty fucking egalitarian, and people don't want like violence and bloodshed. And people are willing to tolerate a great amount, even when it makes them really angry and rightfully angry. Yeah. I think there's such a danger in these ideas of human nature. It's this idea that's been leveraged in so many different ways to promote capitalism, to promote egalitarianism. And I don't think we have any human nature. I think we're just a very adaptable species, and I think we respond to specific circumstances. And I think if you pit us against each other and put us in these really sort of immiserated contexts where we have to kind of battle it out, we'll reluctantly do so.
Yeah.
Whereas if you allow us to thrive and explore like what's available to us in the world and collaborate on meaningful shit and live rich and rewarding lives, we're going to look very different.
So not necessarily directly linked to violence, but for example, there was, that thing when Richard Spencer, the famous alt-right kind of superstar, got punched by the anarchist. He also got stopped from speaking at certain universities, generally the more progressive ones. And centrists and liberals and even people on the left, of course the right as well, have this idea of freedom being very linked to like this personal liberty and free speech. And I really struggle with it because of this idea of for the good of the community. To me, and I don't know really how to articulate this very well, but that feels more important to me than the idea of being able to say whatever you want or do whatever you want. I guess it's like a libertarian idea to be able to say and do whatever you want. But what do you think is the general idea on free speech, and is that even a useful thing to argue about, like freedom of speech and expression?
Yeah, so I mean, it was interesting that when you're asking me this question, you make this distinction between saying and doing. When I think about speech, I think about speech acts. I think about speech as a physical activity involving your vocal cords and your mouth and your breath and everything else, as physical as like picking up a rock. That does something in the world. It has an effect in the world. If you're the judge and you bang down your gavel and you say you're going to jail, you're having a physical effect on someone's life. You're transforming something. If you're a priest and you say you're married, you're transforming something. You're imposing the state and the church usually onto something, with all the material consequences that has for people. So I think we think realistically about the idea of speech as being as physical an act as everything else with physical consequences. If you're a bunch of like drunken right-wing fucking bigots in a bar and you see a person of color outside and the one person in the group shouts, "Hey, let's get him," you're creating a physical consequence for someone through your words, right? That's a physical act. You can't separate them and go, those are just words, they don't harm anyone, right? You have to look at the whole situation. So when you look at it like that, the reason why people like Richard Spencer should be deplatformed is because they don't respect the freedom of others. They're creating consequences of harm for other people. They're encouraging that. And you can directly trace their language to the violence experienced by the people that they're opposed to. So you're intervening in a physical act. It's just the same as if you're intervening in Richard Spencer trying to shoot someone. There's no fundamental distinction between the two. Just because there's a longer path taken by the one doesn't mean it's not the same thing. So I think it's really important to deplatform people like that in the interests of free speech. Because actual free speech, and everyone should be free to say what they want, right? If it's reciprocal. And what you find with everyone on the right who uses this idea of free speech as a platform to like espouse their shitty views, they're not tolerant of other people's freedom. They want to shut down the freedoms of everyone else. If they got their way, the world would look like some white supremacist Handmaid's Tale. Like, those things start with words and then they very quickly transform into physical acts that transform society. So when we're acting against someone leveraging this idea of free speech in this disingenuous, intolerant, non-reciprocal way, we're intervening in the same way as if we're stopping them from firing randomly into a crowd.
Very powerful point.
I think there's also direct impact as well. I mean, you speak about the kind of incitement of action following from that as this kind of like longer route to problematic actions as such. But there is also the direct effect of like psychological harm. And that is also just as real as physical harm. If you tell someone they're a piece of shit every day, eventually they're going to believe it and that is going to harm them. So I think there's also that to consider as well.
Yeah, totally. And it's actually going to harm them physically in the sense that their neurobiology changes, right?
Exactly.
Like I've never liked this like strong divide between words and action. I think we have to, in terms of consequences and ethics, we have to think about them both in the same way.
Yeah, I agree.
I haven't thought about that before. It's a very good point. So, Aragorn, what would you personally say? Because anarchists seem to differ on this, particularly from what I've read of anarcho-primitivism, which is this idea of like that when we were kind of hunter-gatherer groups, the world was better. What would you say is the root kind of like evil, if you will? Because, for example, primitivists would say civilization and the agricultural revolution is where it kind of started. And then other anarchists would say capitalism. So like 400 years ago, industrial revolution. But in your opinion, what is the like roots kind of start of where the problems came from?
I think there is something interesting in trying to trace these things back. And, is there an original form of hierarchy and domination? Is it our relation to other animals? Is it our relation to the natural world? Is it when the first chief or shaman sought authority over the community? Is it patriarchy, right? And who knows? I mean, it could be that there's an original form of hierarchy and domination that then was extrapolated over more and more of social life and emerged in all these different sort of structures that we see today. But it's an interesting speculative exercise. And so I know with John Zerzan, sort of famous anarcho-primitivist, he admits that a lot of his stuff is quite speculative, like is language the original form of domination, for instance? Is number the original form? Is the idea of abstract time the original form of hierarchy and domination? You can take this stuff as far back as you want. But I think the danger in tracing these sort of mythic origins, they're mythical, right? We don't have any hard evidence for this stuff. Trying to figure out what kind of hierarchy and domination was around 100,000 years ago is like a highly speculative pursuit. And on the other hand, it leads to very quickly to certain sorts of ideological rigidity, right? And you see this with some of the sort of anti-civ and anarcho-primitivist crowd, where it's like civilization is it, and it's when we had sedentary agriculture that things went bad, and we need to go back to this sort of like small band, nomadic, gatherer-hunter sort of framework. Otherwise, we just alienated from everything in ourselves. I don't know. I like making music with technology. I don't know if I necessarily want to go back to some mythic origin. I also don't know if I necessarily want to go forward into like super high-tech dystopia, but I think it's much more useful to trace the various sort of forms of hierarchy and domination around us as they currently exist, and to trace them back and to look at them as a complex. So there's this sort of quite cheesy use of Deleuze's idea of assemblage nowadays, this whole field of assemblage theory that's cropped up, where people talk about assemblages, right? In French, it's agencement, which has this connotation of agency, of doing. But assemblage being this sort of mishmash collection, almost this like bricolage, or this like, what do you call it? It's like a mosaic, not mosaic, but it's not neatly plugged in together. It's just this mess of different heterogeneous sort of things that are combined in weird ways that feed back on each other and give rise to stuff. And I think we need to think about it in terms of an assemblage. So it's similar to the idea of intersectionality, but intersectionality often posits this quite seamless kind of, here are your 7 axes of oppression, and where do you situate yourself on this little grid? And whereas the assemblage is much more this sort of like nebulous, ever-transforming thing that's kind of connected in all sorts of messy ways and is never quite complete, which is good because it then has possibilities to be like undermined and transformed and subverted. But I think if we think about stuff in that way, instead of tracing mythic origins, we have a much more useful analysis of the present than if we just sort of, whatever, like rigid Marxist-Leninists going, capitalism is the base and everything else is just the emergent superstructure from that base,
Yeah, I think it's more meaningful to everyone to just focus on what's happening now, I guess. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on power within anarchism. Could you expand on this?
Yeah, so I think the idea of power has shifted within anarchist circles and also more broadly over time. So originally the idea of power that most people had was a purely repressive notion of power. Power is something that people wield over other people. It has a repressive function. And then you had these sort of theorists in the sort of mid-1900s like Michel Foucault, who talked about a different kind of power, right? That power is this sort of the ability to act and the ability to have an action upon an action. So if you think about power as sort of more the sense of capacity then you can see it being enacted in different ways, where you can have a repressive kind of power where people are seeking to assert their authority over others and limit the actions of others. But you can also have the kind of power that enables the actions of others. That's a positive action on an action. So a lot of political philosophy and a lot of people still defer to this repressive notion of power, right? Power is this bad thing. It's people wanting to assert their dominance of other people. But power is also something we can collectively produce. It's something we can use to enhance our lives and our freedoms. So anarchists these days tend to work with this sort of much more positive idea of power. There's, I can't remember who talks about it, I think it was Giorgio Agamben. There's a couple of theorists to talk about this. And they make this distinction, which isn't evident in English, but in French, you can talk about pouvoir and puissance. And pouvoir is like what we typically think of as power over, whereas puissance is more like capacity, it's power to. You know, what is our individual collective power to do something?
I think that's an interesting distinction. I think that's where I was also getting confused. I was reading something about power and how, you know, anarchists kind of aim to take power away. You know, they don't want to give anyone power. But there was this kind of conflicting idea that in order to take power, you have to first kind of strive to have that power. So I'm not explaining this well, but it's kind of like in order to take power away, your aim has to be to get that power, and then that becomes the kind of end goal in itself, which is problematic. But I think it's helpful to see it in terms of taking away that kind of negative conceptualization of power to give the kind of positive conceptualization of agency.
Yeah, so
exactly.
It came from when T and I were like having discussions about what we're going to ask you and what's the interview going to be about. That I was also reading things, and there's this like anarchist idea of we love power but hate authority. Then, you know, T would be like, yeah, but power is an issue because, and then we had kind of have this like back and forth conversation about what is power. You know, so yeah, that idea of power too is awesome. I think maybe it's also the idea of, you know, how in revolutions you are taking power away from an oppressive little group, and then I guess in a Marxist sense or communist sense, correct me if I'm wrong here and completely out, but you are seizing power and then retaining it with a different form of governance. Whereas like anarchists in the sense of power of not like power to, but taking power away from, you would seize power or like means of production and then distribute or diffuse without anybody having kind of the central governance. And it's more like changing it. So seizing power to change the power from power over to power to everyone.
That makes a lot of sense. I think one like simple way of thinking about it is it's another problem of language, right? That we have this term power and it means very different things. So you can talk about a powerful leader, which has these instant connotations of like being able to assert your authority over other people. But we can also talk about a power station, which is generating capacity to do meaningful things. So anarchists want the power stations, they don't want like the authority over.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important distinction.
Green, renewable, mixed energy.
Obvious.
No fossil fuels in anarchist utopia.
So there also seems to be a misconception that if we had an anarchist society, there wouldn't be anyone to do the kind of shitty tasks to keep the community going, you know, like who's going to take the trash out kind of idea, you know. So my question would be, you know, what would motivate people to do those things? And I read an interesting kind of explanation of this in the sense of work, and that in an anarchist society, there would be no need for how we currently understand work, because work requires some kind of fear. You know, you have this fear of losing your job or not being paid, and it's this kind of idea of responsibility for whatever your job is without any power. You have no power in what you do or the choices that you should be able to make. It's just, this is your job, you do it, you have no power, you do this thing, I pay you kind of thing. So it creates the sense of fear in having to do this work. But there would be no work in an anarchist society, right? Like what would motivate people?
So there's two answers to the question. And the one is that the question of who would take out the trash is always asked by white men who have never taken out the fucking trash in their lives, right? Like for most people, it's going to be like, well, we'll fucking take out the trash. Of course, like, you know, if we're living in a community and we've got a communal kitchen and there's some trash, it's going to start smelling like shit after a while. Someone's just going to be like, hey, we need to take out the trash. And if someone's like taking out the trash all the time, they can be like, guys, it's like if you live in a commune with your friends. If it's not a totally dysfunctional commune, it's going to be like, let's figure out how to do shit. Let's form a roster voluntarily between us. And we can each sort of freely decide on what helps the thriving of the space, which allows each of us to thrive within the space. There's no reason why that can't be extrapolated across the whole of society. And in fact, it's how a whole lot of sort of non-capitalist societies, non-state societies have worked. We figure shit out together. And like, it has consequences if we don't. Like, if no one's going to like plant the seeds and grow our food, we're not going to eat. And then very quickly you can be like, oh, fuck. One of us should have really like planted the food this season. Now we're all fucked. The other answer is that if the only reason you're doing something is because you're being forced to do it under threat of like unemployment, which is like a real material threat to like, oh my God, I'm going to die of starvation in the streets, then you shouldn't be doing it anyway. And the fact that you are doing it means there's something wrong with society. If most people in the world spend the majority of their adult lives doing something that they don't want to be doing, just because a small handful of people want to accumulate extreme wealth and extreme power because of that, of the excesses of their labor, then it's not worth doing. There's this really funny book called The Right to be Lazy, written by Paul Lafarge, who I think was Marx's nephew or something like that. You know, and Marx was super about like the workers and everything. But he talks about this bizarre notion we have of the inherent good of work, and how in what a lot of people call a leisure society, an anarchist society, we do far less because so much of the work around us, so much of the labor in contemporary society is just utter bullshit. It fulfills no valuable function whatsoever. Call centers, advertising agencies, you know, like factories that produce new products every 2 years just because of like bullshit marketing that tells people they need to get a new cell phone every 2 years, you know, like built-in obsolescence into products, like all this kind of stuff perpetuates a certain amount of work in society that's completely unnecessary. That's a completely alienated kind of work. And this is something where Marx's discussion of alienation is actually quite interesting, is that in a communist or an anarchist society, there would be no separation between work and life. Free labor would just be something you do throughout the day in collaboration with the people around you to get the shit done that you've collectively decided is worth doing, you know? And that could be mining coltan for cell phones, or you could just decide like, actually, we don't find cell phones that important in our anarchist society, so let's rather just farm a bit and have more leisure time and write some poetry. So I think there'd be positive incentives as opposed to negative ones. There'd still be an incentive to do stuff just to create a more thriving environment around you and to enrich your own life. Whereas currently it's just like this negative incentive of like, do it or else.
Yeah.
You know, and it's certainly not voluntary. There's this terrible myth amongst sort of free market people who want like a free market society, you know, capitalist libertarian dystopia where everyone's selling their labor voluntarily. But, you know, if the alternative to like freely selling your labor to the employer is like starving on the streets, you know,
It's not a choice.
It's not
Yeah.
any kind of freedom.
that's someone holding a gun to your head and saying your money or your life. That's a very impoverished choice. And if that's the only choice you have, there's something deeply fucking wrong there. You're being mugged, right?
Yeah.
And I think where a lot of people get stuck as well is kind of trying to envision a more complex anarchist society. If you think of the complexity of the world that we live in now, and envisioning an anarchist version of that is obviously quite difficult because we have nothing to base it off of. But I think where people get stuck is they're thinking of these so-called shitty jobs in the context of a capitalist society. So the more complex the society becomes, the more you kind of need complex operations for dealing with things. So this idea of, you know, communal responsibility for, say, taking out the trash becomes a little bit ridiculous in a sense that you need more complex systems. So then it necessitates people to have slightly more specialized knowledge to deal with those things. But I think where people fall short in realizing that that can still happen, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we could still have very complex societies. But the thing is that those specialized jobs, even for the so-called shitty jobs of taking out the trash or the sewage or whatever, could still be specialized, could still be complex the way that they are now, but it wouldn't be seen as a shitty job because you acknowledge the worth in making everything better for everyone. So it wouldn't be this kind of gun to your head, you're going to do the shittiest of shitty work for basically nothing just to survive, if you can even call it survival. It would be more, yes, we're developing these complex systems of work, even if it's not necessarily pleasant because you're smelling shit all day, but you realize that it's an important role, and maybe you're just really good at whatever that task is, you know, and you do it voluntarily.
But there's also, so one of the things that anarchists discuss is this idea of specialization and how, in an anarchist society, people would share equally in the shitty work, right? So, it's not like one person would be the garbage person and that's their life role. Because I don't think anyone really wants to, no one feels like a deep natural proclivity towards taking out trash all the time. We all share that task, based on our abilities and on the needs of society and the individuals in that society. We figure out how to apportion the shitty tasks and the wonderful tasks relatively equally, right? It's the same as when we're sitting around in our sort of little anarchist community making decisions. We each get a chance to sort of facilitate that conversation. We don't have natural leaders forming or anything like that. We each get a chance to feel empowered and to help form the direction of the context in which we find ourselves. So, you might find in anarchist society, like Monday, I'll wash the dishes. Tuesday, I'll make the food. Wednesday, I'll take out the trash. Thursday, I'm going to still chill out and write some music. And that's kind of it, because there's not enough work to do in anarchist society. So why force yourself into this 5-day week of 8 hours a day? And this is very arbitrary, of course. Maybe you work 2 hours a day for 3 days a week, and everything that your society regards as being of real value is done within that time. And then we have a lot of time outside of that to really, really do whatever it is we want to do.
Well, what about when you get to things like doctors or education and healthcare? Do you not need more specialized people in that way? Because obviously, just because we had an anarchist society doesn't mean people wouldn't get sick and injured, and the very physical reality of the world wouldn't exist.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, when I'm talking about the simple sort of social tasks like taking out the trash, most people can take out the trash. I'm not saying everyone gets 1 day a month to be a neurosurgeon, because that society would diminish in number very rapidly. But yeah, I think what we would find is people with natural sort of desires and proclivities towards certain things. People are all different. People will be better at some shit than other people, right? So what we try to do is nurture each person's sort of inherent and unfolding talents and interests and desires, which we could do better in an anarchist society than we can now, and try help each other get to the places where we want to be in our lives. If it's one person's role in that society to just write songs that they play around the campfire on a Friday night, and that is a deeply valued social function, that's what that person does. They're just like the poet in the village kind of thing. Not that a village is the only scale on which these things can function. As we saw in Spain and numerous other sort of anarchist projects, it can function across huge terrains involving millions of people in relatively complex, modern, functioning societies. When I was in Argentina many years back, I stayed at, in 2001, there was a economic collapse in Argentina. And you got to see lots of people who weren't anarchists smashing banks, which was quite cool. But a lot of workplaces shut down. Thousands of workplaces across Argentina, because there was no economy, so there was no viable way in which people could get paid for their labor, and a lot of the bosses just fucked off. And in over 1,000 workplaces, some of them really large, workers just went back and said, no, hang on, but the boss wasn't doing anything useful anyway, let's just fucking restart these places. So I stayed in Hotel Bowen, which is in the middle of Buenos Aires, and it's like a sort of 15-story hotel with a couple of hundred rooms, run completely collectively and equally by however many employees there are, probably 100 or more, who have figured out how to run a hotel in the middle of a busy city sustainably.
With no boss.
With no boss. There's the Zanon tile factory, which is one of the larger ones. There's, I think, several thousand employees. There's Mondragon. There's a lot of these kinds of large projects where people have collected, not on explicitly anarchist principles always, but in equal ways, often where everyone's getting a totally flat salary, for instance. In these very sort of equal collective ways without hierarchy, figuring out how to run complex things. And a lot of that involves sharing the shit tasks, and some involves, people being nurtured towards their natural proclivities. There's this interesting thing where I think we tend to take current society and everything that happens in current society and all the different roles people fulfill in current society, and then we project that onto any future society. So Bookchin has this great line where he says, the assumption that what currently exists necessarily should always exist is the acid that corrodes all visionary thought. There's a lot of stuff nowadays that we wouldn't want to move across to a better society because it's not fulfilling a positive social function. There is a chance we'd lose some good shit along the way. it's more likely that we'd lose most of the bad shit, and that it's, a give and take where we end up actually being better off than we are now. But yeah, I think we still have a lot of the same positive social functions we currently have. And I think a lot more people would be spending their lives doing meaningful things.
And doing things that they're actually passionate about. And I think a lot of the shitty tasks in society, like you mentioned earlier, are generally your unskilled things that everyone can do a little bit of. And as it becomes more specialized, it does tend to be things that people would, if it's useful and needed in that current society, people would generally do it out of a sense of enjoyment and fulfillment.
Because they directly benefit from it. Like a worker is very much more likely to make a quality product if he or she or they can enjoy that product. You know what I mean? Like at the moment you have chocolate or cocoa bean farmers who have never had chocolate in their whole life. And to me that is, like you said, indicative of a deeply fucked society.
Yeah. That's part of Marx's critique of alienation, that you're alienated from the products of your labor and from the people you're producing it with.
Okay, so another thing that comes up all the time that I find when people talk about anarchism is the idea that anarchists don't vote. But what is the anarchists and your personal views as well on voting?
I mean, anarchists are against the idea of the nation state and against the idea of government. So electoral democracy is just a perpetuation of that system. So on a very simple, very simple philosophical level, anarchists are always going to be opposed to the idea of voting because it's relinquishing your personal power to some sort of representative who's supposed to act in your interests, but obviously, as everyone intuitively probably knows, never does really. Make some token concessions towards their demographic, or what do we call the people who voted them in, but is basically serving their own interests based on the position of shitty power they've now been entrenched into. And I mean, this is obvious. We tend to single things out. We tend to scapegoat these problems by finding the worst excesses of corruption and stuff like this. So in South Africa, we can be Zuma and the Zuma's ANC, that was the problem. And if only we had good government instead. And now Ramaphosa's ANC is obviously going to do better. And we're going to have clean government operating for the people without any corruption and nepotism and cronyism and everything else. But I mean, most people are so fucking cynical nowadays about that, right? So there's actually an intuitive sort of low-level anarchist cynicism in a lot of people around the electoral process. And I think it's useful as part of an anarchist tactic to encourage that and to encourage people to look outside of that horizon of possibility and say choosing someone every handful of years to kind of get together in a secret little room with a bunch of other people and supposedly decide on the good of millions of people. That's absurd. That's a really impoverished idea of our capacity,
And of this idea of democracy, because it's actually not really democracy.
Yeah. And I mean, democracy is another one of those terms, right? Left and right and violence and all these things. That's, it's been so overused. Because, I mean, people have used the term democracy to refer to any number of social arrangements, most of which are really fucked and say nothing about true human thriving and equality and freedom and everything else. So, I mean, voting is sort of resigning yourself. It's kind of a very submissive act of I don't really have real autonomy over my life. I don't really have a meaningful say in what my world looks like from day to day. So I'm going to defer to the authority of someone else who, for some set of arbitrary reasons, has become the representative of that kind of authority, who's somehow naturally good at, and super benevolent and the optimal way of figuring out how society should work. So anarchists usually promote this kind of very active form of non-voting, where you don't just passively not vote. You talk about it. You say well, I'm not voting this year. And then people usually go oh my God, you're relinquishing your responsibility as a citizen of a thriving democracy. And how dare you? Usually it's people who want you to vote for the DA, right?
Yeah.
But, when you start entering those conversations, you'll say but why have we reified this specific system? Why do we all just defer responsibility and diminish our own abilities to kind of really learn and grow and be able to have authority of our own lives to this tiny enclave of individuals who seeking their own personal benefit before anything else? right? What in Marxist terms we call the ruling class broadly. Let's think of alternatives. Let's decide together on what should look like. Let's start practicing alternatives. There's another sense in which the question becomes more difficult, where sometimes you'll have really unique situations. In 1994, where there was the first sort of so-called democratic vote, and you could vote for the ANC. I think that was just before I was eligible to vote, like by a few months. But I don't know, I might have voted then, just because it's like a really significant singular thing. It's a singular act of like making sure that the fucking apartheid government fucks right off. I think there are instances where you can vote tactically without endorsing the system and without, and knowing full well that, you're going to be fucked over anyway. You can tactically vote. So, for instance, if there was a candidate who was looking very strong in the polls, who wanted to bring back the death penalty or oppose LGBTQI rights or something like that, I think there'd be a strong ethical imperative just to tactically vote without, acknowledging the limitations of it, but still going, okay, no, I definitely don't want the death penalty back. I definitely don't want homosexuality to be criminalized or anything like that. So let me tactically vote. But more often than not, it's not that case. So it's just different faces on the same sort of basic oppressive neoliberal functioning of global capitalism. So you're basically voting for which shin you want to get kicked in, right? Or which flavor of like shitty ice cream you want. It's the substance of it is largely unchanged, also because of the exigencies of capitalism, right? Because, you can have the most pure-hearted, wonderful, egalitarian leader of the people get into power. The first day they're in power, they can have a closed-door meeting with a bunch of big corporations go, okay, we're going to tell you like what your policies are. And you're going to have like the US dictating your policy, and you're going to have a bunch of billionaires dictating your policy. And, this is what happened in a whole lot of Latin America, where you had these so-called like socialist governments, these leaders for the people, Lula, Chavez, who had good intentions. I think they had really pure and good intentions. They really did want to have government of the people, right? They wanted people to have a meaningful say in governmental process, but the form itself co-opted them. So, the Amazon kept on getting chopped down under so-called socialist regimes in Latin America. The extractive economy, the oil economy carried on. The siphoning off of wealth to the global north carried on. So, I think voting is giving your power away, and it's perpetuating something that is not in the interest of most people, and it disallows people the ability to practice that power, to decide on what their life should look like. I think that's the important conversation worth having around like election times, even if there are instances where you need to tactically vote.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You speak about the need to kind of tactically vote, but do you think that there could be any benefit to, like you said, acknowledging that you're voting for shit or shit, like at least comparing them and seeing what would be kind of the lesser of evils for the majority in theory, even if, the whole system itself corrupts any well-intended people? Do you think that there could be a place for that kind of like small-scale tactical voting where you're voting for the lesser of evils for the benefit? I mean, it's easy for us to say, as middle-class white people, whatever, doesn't matter. But for a lot of people, it does. And I'm not saying that voting is going to solve anyone's problems, but do you think there's a place to find those spaces to kind of promote anarchist thinking and empowering people and all of that, and just in one day go and put a stupid X? I'm not saying to solve problems, but to potentially help the lesser of evils. I get what you're saying about not giving away power to anyone, but is there perhaps a potential small benefit to at least shifting the power away from the ultimate evil to slightly less evil?
But so this is a very complex question, because what are our criteria for measuring the lesser evil, right?
Yeah, sure.
So if you look just in upcoming elections here, look at all the major parties. Look at even the minor parties. I mean, each of them have a huge list of policies that they want to implement or remove or change. And when you're voting for a candidate, when you're voting for a party, you're voting for all those policies. You're not just voting for the ones you like, oh, this person's offering some cultural freedoms, but they're going to like set up nuclear energy infrastructure in the country. Or, this person's going to like enhance policing, but they're also going to like shut down borders. So when you look at globally, you look at the sort of full set of policies, the full scope of different parties' political projects, that question of the lesser evil becomes almost impossible to answer, especially when it's obvious that all of the parties, as soon as they get into power, are answerable to economic forces largely outside of their control. So I think it's a dereliction of responsibility to passively non-vote. I think if you're not voting, you need to do it loudly, and you need to talk about it in a way that builds political possibility. And I think you can build a lot more political possibility that way by finding resonances and solidarities with people around you and creating some sort of collective project than you can by, throwing your lot in with millions of other people and saying, well, hopefully, we don't know yet, but maybe this guy, his marketing campaign was good, so maybe he'll be the good guy, and he's never going to be the fucking good guy. He's already meeting with the mining magnates in 5-star hotels that none of us will ever see in our lives. There is also another answer to this, though, which is that the possibilities for political movement building and resistance are influenced by the kind of government that's in power. So when you have brutally repressive governments, so if you look at the Trump regime at the moment, right, the argument is, I don't know how valid this argument is because it unfolds in different ways in different countries, but the argument is that when you have this brutally repressive sort of reactionary state, you don't have as much political organizing because people are more afraid and they tend to seek safety and comfort more, and stuff becomes a lot more polarized, and that it's in these sort of more sort of tolerant liberal societies under these kinds of regimes, social democratic regimes and stuff, that you find more political resistance because people feel more empowered to act. But we're seeing just as much political resistance under Trump as we were under Obama, right? So I don't think it's necessarily true. I think what happens is that different forms of political resistance arise in different contexts. But the voting question is one of the most difficult debates within the anarchist milieu. And there are some people who will be like, no, we need to tactically vote and, have a critical, we should do that. Other anarchists are like, never, I'm purely, completely ideologically opposed to this idea. And anarchists since the late 1800s have been opposed to the idea of voting. So I think it's just up to each person to be responsible about their decision, if you hold a sort of anarchist political view and you're thinking about voting, then you need to explain it. You need to defend that view. If you're not voting, then you also need to tell people why, I think. I think it's important that these things are discussed and explored.
But what do you think of, you mentioned Murray Bookchin earlier, and currently the resistance in Rojava against ISIS and the Turkish governments as well are kind of based on his idea of municipalism, which I guess is society organized through group voting, but on very small scales. So, I guess that still doesn't really tie in exactly with anarchism because it's not consensus-based. It would still be majority-based. But at least it seems more direct than national elections, for example.
Municipalism is interesting. It's a little bit of a reactionary response. So, Bookchin was an anarchist most of his life. And towards the end of his life, I think he had a mixture of kind of frustration and resentment that shit was just getting worse. And he'd spent his whole life trying to build this anarchist politics and just really bad gout. So he was a grumpy old man in pain all the time. I interviewed a couple of people who used to be part of the Institute for Social Ecology and who knew Bookchin. And they said this. They said he became really sort of a bit depressed and cantankerous later in life. Because it's you've got this wonderful vision and you're trying to build this project, and 50 years go by and it's suddenly all the anarchists are just about dumpster diving for tofu and whatever. And it's kind of frustrating. So he publicly disowned anarchism in the mid-90s and sort of started to develop this alternative that incorporated certain elements of Marxism and democratic socialism into it. And, kind of almost gave up on the anarchist idea just because of the anarchists that he surrounded himself with. I don't know how I feel about municipalism. I think it solves a problem that isn't really there. So I think in application, municipalism looks a lot like anarchism anyway, and that it would end up being that. Or, the sort of implicit tendency in it to form little sort of bureaucratic hierarchies would emerge, and that would be really unfortunate. But yeah, I mean, the fact that people are experimenting with it is amazing. I mean, Rojava is a super complex phenomenon, and I think it's incredibly difficult for Anglophone people thousands of Ks away to figure it out. I know I struggle a lot with figuring out what's going on and, how legit it is and who the good guys are, and it's way complex.
Yeah, I mean, I've even heard from people who go there still like struggle to understand it, because I think, I mean, you are, like you said, you bring your like embedded Anglophone understanding of things.
Yeah, I mean, this happened with the Zapatistas. So when the Zapatistas rose up, and no one knew about them until '94, and suddenly they just like rose up. You had like thousands of masked dudes with guns, like I think marching into Mexico City was what they did on the 1st of January to protest against against NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So the sort of like early phase sort of neoliberal globalization. Suddenly the whole global north, like all the sort of radicals in the global north, are like, oh my God, look at these revolutionaries in the global south, and they're like pretty much leaderless and anonymous, and they have this like grassroots politics. Are they anarchists? And then in Green Anarchy and all these other magazines, you have these like and Anarchy Mag, you have these various debates. No, they're not real anarchists, because they have Subcommandante Marcos as their leader, even though he could be anyone because he has a mask, Like no one really cares who he is, he's just like this sort of token figurehead.
Symbol. Yeah.
No, they are real anarchists, because look at their horizontal form of organizing. So you have a lot of people and also people even going down there, because they did those encuentros or whatever they call them, where they said like, hey, come, we want to meet with you. We want to meet with other struggle movements from around the world and share ideas and everything. So you had all these people like coming with their sort of very Western, like rigid notions of political purity and trying to impose them on something that just didn't map to their categories, which is what's lovely about the Zapatistas, because they always just refused to. They were like, you can call us that if you want. You can also call us this, this, and this. It's not, it doesn't exist within your framework, and that's a good thing. So yeah, I think that's a lot of what's happening in Rojava as well. It's just like a lot of people from the outside going, we don't understand this culture at all, but now we're trying to like sort of like delineate it politically, which is an impossible task.
Yeah, you see the same thing happening in veganism. I saw this infuriating video a day or two ago of these white vegans in India basically arguing with Indian people about what ahimsa means, and like, non-violence, and that they should be vegan. And it was just this very like them going into a circle of like indigenous Indian people telling them how they should be. And it just made me super fucking angry. Because it's really like the goal you have to do that, even though you're promoting like veganism, when you understand none of the context. So probably similar.
What is my partner Chantal uses this phrase a lot: the confidence of the mediocre white man.
Yeah, exactly.
It's that, right? It's like, I've grown up so fucking privileged and pampered and acknowledged that I feel like I'm inherently superior and able to like go tell other people how their life should look. Fucking hell.
That's beautiful. I'm definitely going to use that. Do you think that veganism and anarchism go hand in hand?
So I'd like to say yes. And for a long part of my sort of identification as an anarchist, I've seen them as naturally combined, because the exploitation of other animals is like clearly exactly the same as any other form of hierarchy and domination. We're diminishing the capacity of other beings to experience the full unfolding of their lives, right? It's unnecessary. It's unspeakably cruel. It happens on a scale that is impossible to really even fathom. And yet we could kind of stop doing it tomorrow. So on the one hand, it's the easiest battle in the world to win. It's not an abstraction. It's not the state. It's not capitalism. It's something that can be stopped straight away through our direct participation in exploitative industries. On the other hand, the exploitation of animals is so naturalized, so endemic across so many different societies, and so perennial that people think you're batshit fucking insane, even in sort of left or anarchist circles, when you start speaking about speciesism. So you can like hang out in a group of people who are like raging against the patriarchy and white supremacy and everything else, and you say the word anti-speciesism and like, huh? Like, what the fuck are you on about? Like, what batshit hippie crazy bullshit is this? So for me, it's there's a natural link. It's obvious. It's so obvious to me that I find it confusing that other people don't automatically go, oh, of course. And it's depressing because it's one of the easiest things to solve. But it's probably one of the longest battles that's going to have to be fought. And, I think various other forms of hierarchy and domination might disappear before that one, because it possibly is the most deeply entrenched and naturalized and therefore invisible. Saying that, though, I did a survey with a friend of mine of the anarchist community many years, like 9 years ago, I think. And we surveyed about, 2,500 people or something, self-identified anarchists from around the world. And we asked them questions about diet and speciesism and this kind of stuff. And I think it was something like, so at the time, in the general population, I think it was like 1% of people were vegan, or 0.5% or whatever it was, like quite small. Within the anarchist population, I think it was almost 20%. Within self-identified anarcho-feminist and anarcho-queer circles, and even some sort of green anarchist circles, it was almost 40%. So what it does say is that quite a few people are drawing the link, fortunately, and that there is some intuitive connection between these principles. The more frustrating thing for me, though, is not like, whether there's a link between anti-speciesism and anarchism from the anarchist side, but whether there's a link to any kind of radical politics from the vegan side, because, single issue veganism or very liberal animal rights is it's the most tone-deaf, apolitical, privileged, annoying fucking phenomenon. I remember during the student protests at UCT, I won't even name names, but actually a couple of people there, sort of self-righteous, single-issue white vegans, getting so upset with the student activists because how dare they talk about intersectionality when they're not vegan? It's like, first of all, possibly participate in their struggles and share your views. Yeah. Don't just lecture. And secondly, they're far more fucking intersectional than you are with plant-based diet will magically solve white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism and the state and ableism and it's the most delusional. There's a way in which it makes people feel incredibly self-righteous, and it's incredibly frustrating for me. And I feel that there has been a little bit of a shift over the last decade, that more sort of vegan and animal rights people will seriously at least grapple with these questions, especially people who are more on the animal liberation side, because that naturally sort of draws you into a more radical political perspective, because all the early ALF people were kind of politically radical. I think it is shifting a little bit, but frustratingly slowly. So when I go into those sort of vegan Facebook groups and stuff and I see the sort of level of dialogue unfolding there, it's just oh my God, the blatant racism and blatant ignorance and just aren't small vegan businesses great? That's how we're going to save the planet. And
it's embarrassing, actually.
Yeah. And GM corn is okay because, well, at least it's a vegan crop. The level of reasoning is just embarrassing. Yeah. So, it was a very important project for me for a few years. So when I first became vegan, I was already kind of quite politicized. So one of the first things I counted was but I assumed everyone in the space would have good politics as well. So for a few years, we tried to, through the Vegan Society, we tried to push a more radical politics and met with such resistance and was so unpopular that eventually I was just not my battle anymore.
It's depressing.
Sometimes, but it's not my core kind of focus.
So Aragorn, what keeps you kind of in this theory and fight, if you will, and hopeful, instead of just becoming despondent and nihilistic?
I don't know. Despondence and nihilism are kind of boring. Although I do like the idea of nihilism in the Nietzschean sense. So Nietzsche talks about kind of nihilism being the sort of disenchantment of the world, where all the sort of idols, all the sort of dogmas, all the sort of transcendental categories that inform life are kind of dissolved for you, and you recognize that there's no inherent meaning in the universe. And that's a profound existential crisis for a lot of people. And a lot of people react really badly to that and, seek refuge in dogmas and ideologies and oppressive relations of various kinds. But you have to work through nihilism. It's an incredible opportunity to, have all the bullshit you brought up with kind of disenchanted for you, to peek behind the curtain and go oh, hang on. if there's no inherent meaning in the world, then meaning is something that we create individually and collectively, which is an incredibly anarchist idea, right? So a lot of anarchists actually love Nietzsche for this. So I am a nihilist in that sense, or someone working through nihilism, through the nihilist project. So what Deleuze would call active nihilism, not passive nihilism, not just like the victim of something, but like actually taking a constructive role in overcoming this. That sort of relationship to meaning is something that allows you, it expands your scope for what's possible in the world, right? It's, if there are none of these sort of categories of meaning out there in the world that are imposed on me, God, the state, capital, all these transcendental categories that supposedly pre-exist me and will live long past me. If none of those are actually real in that deep metaphysical sense, and they're just historically contingent things, then meaning is what I do and what we do, right? And that's a really fun place to be. It's exploring possibility is the thing that kind of keeps me going. And, I hate Derek Jensen. I fucking hate him. He's an asshole. But he does say, he has this incredible essay where he talks about hope. And he says that, you have to exist beyond both hope and hopelessness, right? Because hope is fucking naive and you're going to get let down and get burned out. And, it's not sustainable. The world is not positioned in such a way and is not unfolding in such a way that hope is realistic. On the other hand, hopelessness just resigns you to passivity, and that's a pretty shitty, depressing place to be. And, how many packets of crisps and shitty episodes of American TV can you watch before you give up entirely and you can spend every day just feeling miserable? And so to think beyond those categories of hope and hopelessness is also really useful, because then it also becomes a speculative opportunity of what do I want shit to look like? What small changes can I make in my life and the lives of people around me in order to move in that direction? And hey, I might fail, and it's very likely that I'll fail, but it's the process, it's the practice of overcoming this stuff. It's there's no sort of final teleological goal. There's no end principle in the universe that we're all headed towards that should inform our everyday experience. There's just now, and there's the stuff that we do now to try and make stuff better tomorrow, right? So it's this really situated practice of just trying to extricate ourselves from the crap we find ourselves in and see which directions we can go in and what opens up or closes down when we push in different directions. So I don't know, maybe it's natural inquisitiveness or something, but I've always been, my worst fear is being bored. And that's probably it. It's even if I know the stuff I'm going to do is going to fail miserably, I'd rather do it, because doing nothing is the most terrifying thing in the world for me. The universe abhors a vacuum, as I think it was Buckminster Fuller who said that.
Great
Great
answer.
Yeah, it's an awesome way to conceptualize it.
So in terms of people looking into finding meaning in other things, what do you think about the idea of people still being religious but interested in anarchism? So, for example, Leo Tolstoy, I think, identified as a Christian anarchist. Is that not an oxymoron?
I mean, anarchists are historically against religion, but they're against something specific. They're against organized religion that is usually leveraged to serve the needs of the state and capital, even in non-Western societies. So even in sort of very strongly temple-centric versions of Buddhism. The temple served a very authoritarian function, and even created sort of several ideological principles of Buddhism about don't worry about the current life. That's just an illusion. Don't try to struggle too much against all the shitty stuff around you. Blah, blah, blah. It's all about transcending that. Religion can alienate you from your power, can take your power away from you. It's an inherently authoritarian thing in its organized form. Spirituality is something else, and I'm not particularly spiritual. I mean, if I was spiritual, it would probably be some weird non-theistic earth pagan spirituality thing. I mean, who knows? But people do find capacity in certain forms of spirituality that allow them to describe their relationship to themselves in the world. Paganism is really good at this, and a lot of contemporary pagans will, they know that the sort of language of paganism and all the little like bullet point sort of things that are supposed to be components of paganism, and this is the right way of doing this, and this is how you dance around the fire, and they know it's all made up. It's not like the universe naturally contains these things. We have made them. But the practice itself still has many positive aspects. So I think it's, the question to be asked about spirituality is, from an anarchist perspective, I don't think is like, oh my God, wherever it exists, we must shut it down. We're all like a bunch of hardcore Dawkins atheists, which is a very hyper-dogmatic religious thing in itself, in the real sense of the word, when you really look at what they do and how dogmatic they are and intolerant they are and cultish, actually. But instead, is this enriching people's lives? Do people have autonomy within this? Is it part of a meaningful collective practice? Is it a healthy, functioning, positive part of social life or not? So when you look at stuff like Tolstoy, he identified with a lot of stuff in Christianity, and a lot of that's sort of contextually bound, it's like 100 plus years ago. But he was born into an incredibly wealthy family, and he collectivized all his land. He gave all his land away to the people that lived and worked on it, and created this sort of very egalitarian communal environment, connected with these very sort of loose principles from Christianity that are the kind of egalitarian ones that anyone could kind of identify with. Just be nice to each other and all that kind of platitudinous shit, right? So I think to the extent that people's interpretation of religious texts and their personal spirituality is enriching for them and is aimed against sort of oppressive social relations, then it's fine. And we all have stories that we tell ourselves in order to endure the world, right? We all have a narrative. And the only important question to really ask about that is that, am I writing this narrative or is it writing me? So, if I'm creating my spirituality or co-creating my spirituality, that's,
Good answer.
So I think to kind of end off, if you could just maybe tell us some of the stuff that you're involved with, just so that people can also kind of find more information about the projects that you're involved with. But maybe you could also just tell us about the documentary that you were making about anarchism. You said that it wasn't ever released, right?
Yeah, so, the introduction probably made me sound a lot busier than I really am. Because, those are a lot of different projects that I was involved in throughout the years. But, right now, during the day, I work for a nonprofit organization called New Frame. And, we're progressive media. So we have a website where we publish sort of really interesting, politically relevant stuff from a broadly progressive or left perspective. I guess I'm kind of the token anarchist there. And hopefully do my little bit to like sort of push people a little bit in like a good direction. But there are a lot of people going in wonderful directions there anyway, and it's a really, really rewarding space to be in. So I think that's a really interesting project for me to be involved in because it's funded and it's well organized because Anarchists are a really good organization as well. But we're also looking at opening a radical bookstore and social center kind of space later this year. And it's really, these are projects that I've sort of experimented with in various ways throughout my adult life. And it's this really interesting space now where there is a really sort of good source of funding that's creating opportunity for lots of people like me to kind of start experimenting with stuff on a larger and more sustainable scale. So I'm very excited about that. Outside of that, I make a lot of music at the moment. I'm involved with the Experimental Music Festival still, although it's not Edge of Wrong anymore. We kind of ditched that and we try and do something new because Edge of Wrong had become a little bit kind of stale, and it was this cultural exchange program between Norway and South Africa, and it kind of, I think the Norwegian guys got a bit bored of it, and it started to become this really weird thing where it was these two very separate crowds, the internationals and the locals, and they weren't really engaging with each other much anymore. So we're trying to create something new this year that's much more locally grounded. And, it plays into that ethos, that sort of idea that part of any meaningful political project needs to be sort of creating dynamic spaces for cultural experimentation. So for me, my musical stuff is linked to my politics because, it's also about like pushing up against the categories of the world as it's presented to you through culture and saying there's other possibilities, other ways music and sound. There's other ways a film can look. The projects I'm involved in just vary from month to month, I guess. So I'll jump into things and jump out of them. But yeah, so the documentary, we had this very naive idea that we were going to travel around the world and we were going to interview 100 anarchists. We were going to make this feature-length documentary about the history and the ideas of anarchism and how it looks in the contemporary world. And it was hugely overly ambitious. We did interview over 100 anarchists on 4 continents, and we traveled for 6 months to do it. And I still have a mountain of hard drives at my house with all the raw interviews, and some of the people have passed on, and some of them probably aren't anarchists anymore, and some of them said the most incredible things, and it's like this really sort of, for me, this very valuable archive that we're currently trying to do something with, because we've realized it's impossible to make a definitive feature-length film about this, not only because anarchism doesn't lend itself to these sort of definitive definitions, but because the actual scope of it, the actual history of it, the actual way it looks around the world today is so vast that you would do a disservice to it if you try to encapsulate it in 90 minutes. So what we're trying to do now is create a searchable online indexed archive with all the raw interviews. So you can go by category and say, I want to learn about mutual aid. And then it'll pop up 20 video clips from 20 different people around the world. But even this is quite an ambitious project. We interviewed people in several different languages. We had people who were going to translate for us that never were able to. So we got a lot of stuff in Portuguese and Spanish and German and French that we may never get translated. So it was I regard myself as incredibly fortunate to have had the experience of trying to form the documentary, even though the end project failed, because it completely changed my understanding of anarchism. Before that, my encounters with the stuff were mostly through a small bunch of anarchists locally and through reading and through interacting with people online. And suddenly going out into the world and hanging out in an anarchist squat in Brazil and going to an anarchist social center in Switzerland and going to an anarchist book fair in Seattle, and these things were amazing. It's it looks so different in different places, and there's so much internal dynamism, there's so many different perspectives. So I feel it gave me this wonderful overview and sense of deep connection to lots and lots of different anarchist projects, which has helped me to be able to talk about it and write about it and develop my own projects. So bolo'bolo never would have happened if we hadn't traveled and tried to do our documentary, for instance. Because when we traveled and we went to all the sort of social centers and autonomous spaces around the world, that was the one thing that we brought home with us instantly. We got back to Cape Town and we were like, holy fuck, we need to make one of those spaces. There's none of them in South Africa. This is such an important thing. I hope someone makes a documentary on it one day. It won't be us, but I think it's such a marginalized part of social history, of political history. It's really strange. You get this phenomenon that as an anarchist you'll experience often, where you're sitting around in a circle of relatively politically progressive people, and they're coming up with these ways of talking about the world. They're coming up with these sort of different interesting projects that they think are really new and fresh and novel, and oh my God, we're the first people to ever come up with this idea. And you're sitting there going but anarchists were doing that in the 1890s already. Sharing anarchist ideas more widely through whatever context is really important for me because of that, because it's surreal that it's been so marginalized. And I don't know if it's the inherent fear of it or what it is. There are many different theories as to why this is, but anarchism is almost like the hidden side of history. It's the hidden side of human possibility. Anything that doesn't fit into that historical mandate of great leaders and great national movements and these sort of big monolithic struggles kind of gets lost because it's harder to talk about and write about. And histories of common people trying to live their lives in autonomous ways is not the same as writing a history of Napoleon. Mm-hmm. So the documentary, if it left me with anything, it left me with this sort of strong commitment to trying to spread these ideas more widely.
So if there's anyone listening, and we'll post your links and everything, and not that we have the widest reach, but people who are interested, who can assist in translation or think they could help your online project in some way, could we kind of share that?
Yeah, of course.
So for anyone listening, either contact us or Aragorn via the links we put at the end of the episode, and maybe we can assist somehow.
I think what was really also lovely for me doing the documentary was just the images of the different people that we interviewed. Even when you just like put them out on a page and you have this like 100 faces and you're looking at them and you're going like, oh, it's not just a bunch of like crusty young punks. There's like this 90-year-old woman and there's this like old Brazilian guy and there's like this huge diversity of people. And instantly, as soon as you see that, I think for most people they're challenged. So I've done sort of talks on anarchism before, and I'll often open with some pictures of the people we interviewed, because then people are instantly like, oh, they're anarchists too. Like that little 90-year-old lady's an anarchist.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
You mentioned that during the documentary, bolo'bolo wouldn't have happened without that. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so bolo'bolo was this like wildly idealistic space. When my ex and I, who I'd formed the documentary with, when we moved down to Cape Town, we had this weird random offer of like taking over a little vegan restaurant. And we already had this notion of like, oh my God, we want to create an info shop, a radical social center. And it was in Muizenberg, the sleepy sort of surfer community full of like hippies, but kind of really nice in a way as well. A little bit utopian in its own way. And so we took over this vegan restaurant, and instantly I was like, okay, but let's like put some bookshelves up and like some posters, and and we changed the vibe a lot. And some of the sort of local Muizenberg hippies were a bit freaked out by this, but it became quite popular. And this really, really wonderful reading group emerged very organically out of it. I can't even remember how it started, but suddenly we had this anarchist reading group every Sunday, and I mean, up to 20 people would come, and people were there, rain or shine. Like it was a solid thing. And we dealt with a huge amount of stuff during the group, a lot of like consensus process, a lot of people like dealing with really deep, like personal stuff. So it wasn't just an anarchist reading group, it was this like profoundly cathartic space for a lot of people who are feeling the same about the various forms of hierarchy and domination around them. And out of that, we created the bolo'bolo Collective, where we were like, we don't really want to just have a little restaurant in Muizenberg with a couple of books. Let's do something a little bit bigger. And we found the secondhand bookshop in Observatory in Lower Main Road, which is like the sort of like, at that point, was this like sort of bohemian hub of sort of Cape Town, slightly grungy, suburban. Yeah, it was the place where everyone went and got pissed on a Friday night, but it was also like we found the weird artists and eccentrics. And we spoke to the guy who owned the bookstore, and we were like, can we share your space? Of course you can. It was like just super coincidental, whole set of like wonderful synchronicities. And yeah, before we knew it, we had this like wonderful little radical social center, and we served vegan food, and we sold lots of books, and we printed 1 million zines, and we had badges, and we had stickers. We had posters up on the walls and all our flags, and we did tons of different events, book launches, screenings, workshops, talks, like pretty much, yeah, it was like, there was a lot of like wild energy around it at the time, because there was all these people who were like, oh fuck, we can make shit happen. We have the space in like one of the busiest streets in Cape Town. People are coming in. They're receptive to these ideas. Like anything's possible. And yeah, it was a really wonderful experimental exploratory space for us. And yeah, we created the Anarchist Book, well, not created, but we sort of ran the Anarchist Book Fair. We'd been doing it before for a year or two, but kind of grew the Anarchist Book Fair through that as well. Published a bunch of our own books. Did quite a bunch of like really wonderful stuff. Had an anarchist winter school. And yeah, kind of shut it down. I think it was the end of 2015 we shut it down. 2014. But yeah, like a couple of years back. Because the rent kind of doubled, and people, it was the end of a year, and people going in different directions within the collective to like study or go overseas or work. And so it seemed like a natural time to wrap it up. So we went for about 3 years in total. And yeah, it felt like a really good project to be involved in, because it had a natural lifespan. We didn't try to keep it going when we realized that the time was up for it.
It had a very profound effect on me. Being young and impressionable and interested, I still never really felt like very much related anywhere. Even the vegans that I was meeting, or vegan restaurants I'd go to at the time, all had like a Buddha in them, or I've always been kind of annoyed by this whole like hippie vibe that veganism seems to attract. And I remember walking into your cafe in Muizenberg, and the first thing I noticed was this fat book on the wall titled Hatred of Capitalism. and then your ex actually, Steffi, she's also a good friend of mine. I stayed with her end of 2017 in Austria. She was working there too, and you were making the food, and then she brought the food out with her own food and sat with my friends and I at the table, and I was like, oh, this is cool that like the waitress is sitting with us and eating. And that's how we, like me and like 5 other friends, kind of met her and made friends, and then you kind of indirectly. And then I loved the bolo'bolo info shop in Observatory that you spoke about, because you had this massive Circle A sticker on the window that was like unavoidable. Any personal car walking down the street would just see this huge Anarchy symbol on the window. Yeah, it was an amazing, that had like that period of time had such an impact on me, of doing food at bombs and then film screenings, and even just randomly chatting to random people who would come in. You know, it was great. So
yeah. I think the best part for me is just like outside of all the events and everything else, that it was just this like quite charged space, but also quite a like safe space where you would go there. I mean, there's a lot of people told me this. People who were kind of recently politicized or just didn't have other people around them to talk to about stuff. Is they would go there and be like, fuck, I can actually bitch about capitalism to someone. Or I can actually, oh my God, there's a group of people meeting there about forming like a radical feminist collective. Like, this is my place, these are my people. So I think that was really useful for us, just to create that social space outside of where you knew you could express values outside of the dominant ones. And I think we were very successful at that. We had lots of different groups coming in, individuals coming in, and like trying to tap into like what was there. Yeah, I've experimented with both of these things over time. Like, on the one hand, do you sort of lead people into stuff gently? So like, with the one vegan restaurant I had, it was very much like plant-based food, and didn't say the word veganism anywhere on the menu. And it's, this very sort of soft, sort of implicit way of trying to talk to people. And then sometimes I've just been like full on, like, fuck that, full animal liberation now. Like,
yeah.
Yeah, and with the Anarchist info shop. So when we were in Muizenberg, also called bolo'bolo, it was just, I mean, apart from the books on the shelves, it was very subtle, There were no Circle A's on the window.
Yeah.
But when the collective reached Observatory, we were just like, fuck it. Like, let's be proud about what we are, and let's say it openly. Because anarchism is seen as so extreme or marginal or naive and all these kind of pejoratives attached to it, a lot of people don't feel they're able to identify. You see this a lot in academia as well. People don't feel it's legitimate to identify in that way. So there's all these euphemisms. I'm a libertarian socialist, or whatever it is. I'm kind of sort of on the far left, or there's all these different ways in which people try like articulate their anarchism without saying the word, or whatever it is. But I don't think that works. I think people respect honesty and integrity more, and I think people, they respect authenticity more. It forms a deeper connection when you know that someone is being authentic to you than if they're trying to like be a fucking Jehovah's Witness, and like give you a little pamphlet and be like, let me talk to you about, like, I'm not actually trying to indoctrinate you into my cult, but
I love that the bolo'bolo one in Observatory, you had this huge mural of an oncoming train with the Circle A on the front of it and all these people on the train. It was like very clear what was happening in that space.
Yeah. So and that's based on a real historical moment. So when Nestor Makhno was in Ukraine, there was this whole sort of set of free territories across the Ukraine in like the sort of, I think, like 1918, 1919, somewhere around there. Again, my history shit. But Makhno and this whole sort of group around Makhno were sort of traveling around different parts of Ukraine and sort of liberating villages and like encouraging people to just sort of live autonomously outside of the state. And that movement was incredibly huge and successful while it lasted. It didn't last long because of obviously everyone trying to shut it down instantly. But there was, I think her name was Maria Nikiforova, if I'm thinking of the right person, who used to ride this black train around the railways there, and like this anarchist train, and like, also go from village to village on this like anarchist train.
Wow, that's amazing.
We love this image of like,
yeah,
first of all, it's this like powerful woman at the helm of this thing, but
the metaphor of the train,
the black anarchist train like coming down the tracks,
Yeah, so cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so you mentioned doing music, a lot of musical projects, and you go under the name Aragorn 23. Where does that come from, and what is anarchist audio science, as it says on your website?
So the 23 thing is funny because if you Google the 23 phenomenon online, you'll find all these weird links. There's like a whole sort of little subculture around this idea of 23. And it started, I think, with William Burroughs. And then there was an author in the 70s, Robert Anton Wilson, who was a big influence on me when I was in my early teenage years. He wrote this book called Prometheus Rising and another one called Quantum Psychology, which sounds a bit flaky, but it's not. He identified as an anarchist for a long time, and he was also really into the sort of psychedelic counterculture at the time. He was friends with Timothy Leary and people like that. And they were also sort of very excited about like sort of challenging different forms of dogmatic thought and opening up different parts of sort of human possibility and shifting towards a saner society. Robert Anton Wilson became a little bit of a reactionary later on in life. But he also used this like idea of 23 as this marker, this sort of like very subtle coded marker for, you know, belonging to this like interesting group / non-group, you know. There's a great comic called The Invisibles by Grant Morrison, who's also really influenced by this stuff. And he talks about how the Invisibles wear the blank badge. You know, so it's this idea of, like, I see you, you're part of the same little, you know, hidden network of people that I'm part of, but there's no explicit marker. And this idea of 23 is this kind of very loose, you know, like unless you know what it is, you don't know what it is, right? Why would someone have a 23 after the name or something like that? But it's kind of a fun, tongue-in-cheek sort of way of creating a community around the idea that it's all an act of self-creation. You know, there's no dogma to this thing. It's just we've all chosen to be part of this weird little clandestine network. So you'll find a couple of musicians use the 23, for instance. I started doing it when I was very young, and I just never grew out of it. And then it became like online sort of email addresses and handles and whatever. So just kind of, sometimes I look at it and I'm like, it's very cheesy, but it's kind of stuck. Especially when your first name is Aragorn and you're like, oh, now I just sound like some weird, like 13-year-old role player or something. But I don't know what anarchist audio science is because, I kind of just unsucked that when I was building my new site. But I'm really, really interested in experimenting with different ways of creating music. And also ways that you don't have complete control over. I'm very interested in this idea of creating a space of musical possibility and then letting it unfold in its own way. So I used to do this with algorithmic music, where I would sort of program stuff that read different data sets, different non-musical data sets. So like a climate change data set of like average climatic change in some region over so many years, or average rainfall over this, you know, or with factory farmed animals, right, where it's sort of modeling the average sort of pitches of like distress calls and number of deaths per second and all this kind of stuff, and taking all these different data sets that have nothing to do with music, but seeing if by translating them algorithmically into music, you can express them in a different way that people will have a different connection to than if you're just talking about numbers. It's mostly a creative pursuit, though. I mean, that's like a good justification for it, but it's not actually the primary reason I do it. It's just, for me, it's very interesting to see what these different possibilities are, and also to surprise myself musically. Like, I'm not really into the idea, and perhaps just because I can't actually do it, but I mean, I'm not really into the idea of like mastering an instrument and being like the world's most virtuoso guitar player and look at the power I have over my instrument. I have a much more anarchist approach to music where I'm like, you know, let's just create a space and see what unfolds. So I'm currently really into modular synthesis. And so modular synthesis is how synthesizers started. So nowadays when you think about a synthesizer, it's like a thing with a keyboard and a bunch of sort of knobs and dials, and, you know, and it has, inside of it, the electronics are wired together in a very specific way based on an assumption about what you want to do with it. What modular synthesizers do is they say, no, we're not going to wire the electronics together at all. You're going to do that with a bunch of little audio cables. So you're going to form all the connections between all the different parts of your synthesizer, which you're going to build out of like whatever you want, whatever different little bits and pieces, whatever modules you want. And it's, I mean, from a creative perspective, it's like completely infinite. And people come up with completely novel forms of like musical expression through it. But you can also create these sort of weird little networks of feedback and sudden sort of changes and turbulence that mimic how the natural world works. There are even sort of circuits that are properly mathematically chaotic, that exhibit proper mathematically chaotic behavior. So sort of like weird semi-cyclical behavior, but that's never quite repetitive. Like yeah. It's the same principle as that like old cliche of the butterfly flapping its wings causing the hurricane somewhere else in the world. It's using that same kind of modeling of a complex nonlinear system where small changes can cause dramatic shifts in behavior. Plugging that all together in a musical ecosystem, and ecosystem is probably the best word to use for it. And then just seeing what happens. And so I'll often like patch together something with a modular synth. This is like common to a lot of people I know who are into it. You sort of patch together your thing, you wire the sort of circuitry together for the day, you put on headphones, and then it's just this whole world of sort of sonic novelty that unfolds in front of you that you don't have really control over. You know, it's kind of can surprise you in all these different ways.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Generally, it fits under the genre of noise music, right? Like how would people find this type of music? Because there has to be something that is like searchable or...
Noise is a term that people are used in so many different ways. You know, the sort of like old idea of noise music was this very masculine idea of like just sheer volume and intensity and no structure and just like blasts of like, you know, sonic extremes, you know, like deep rumbling bass and super high frequencies. And it was meant to have a really physical effect on people. So early noise artists and early industrial artists all about this, like music having this physical effect. It's much more nuanced nowadays, and it's a much wider genre, but most of my stuff probably falls outside of what most people would regard as noise. I think, I can't really categorize what I do, but I think it's some mix of like sort of electronic ambient stuff and aleatoric stuff, so like self-generating stuff, algorithmic stuff. I do some sort of stuff that I'm very inspired by, like 70s so-called cosmischer music. So it's a bunch of like German hippies who got really into synthesizers and made cosmic music. So you can imagine what that sounds like. There's very spacey sort of like digital sequences and like whooshing sounds. And I really love that stuff. So I make some stuff that sounds like that. I think modular synthesis undermines genre in a lot of ways, though. I mean, I think it's almost becoming a new genre where people talk about modular music because it does tend to have its own sort of weird relationship to structure and musicality. So I think that, I used to make a lot of quite genre-specific stuff, but so in the 90s I made a lot of techno and like some trance for my sins because I'm a bit of a hippie as well. But
we'll post a link to your website as well.
And if anyone's curious, we'll be using one of your songs at the end of the episode, so at least there's a little bit of a snippet for them to get a taste of it.
So I'm actually launching a record. Next Saturday is International Record Store Day. And because I have access to a record lathe, I can be indulgent and cut my own record. So it's like the vanity press for music. But we're going to launch it at Mr. Vinyl at 44 Stanley next Saturday as part of Record Store Day. And I think there's going to be Felix Leband there, who's really awesome.
Oh, awesome.
And a bunch of other sort of DJs and musicians and stuff.
Cool. Well, this episode should be out before that.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, go check it out.
Also, we'll probably be there, so...
Yeah, and we're kind of a big deal, so...
Not really.
No, we're not.
We'll be introverting in the corner while Aragorn makes music.
Come meet the hosts.
But thank you so much for spending time with us today and enlightening us. It was really cool to talk to you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. It was loads of fun.
Yeah, and a last thing, what should people look up and visit and Google search to find some of the stuff you're interested in? Is there anything else you want to...
We still have the website up for bolo'bolo, which has a couple of PDFs of the books we made and the newspaper we used to put out. So if you go to bolo'bolo, bolo.co.za, you can get a sense of like what it used to be about and see some of the sort of vestigial aspects of it. And then further.co.za, so opposite of closer, further.co.za is like where I put all my music stuff up.
Awesome.
And that links to Bandcamp and stuff. I can't think of anything else really. If you search Aragorn 23 on YouTube, I've got some of my modular stuff up there. So you can see what a modular synth looks like.
Cool. Well, thanks very much.
Yeah, awesome, guys.
Cool. So thanks so much, everyone, for listening to the interview. And thanks again to Aragorn for taking the time out to have such a rad chat with us. hopefully everyone listening got something out of it. I know I definitely did, and I think both of us learned quite a lot from the conversation. So hopefully you enjoyed it.
Yeah, so we're going to end this episode with a song that Aragorn made called Pig off his album Factory Farm Studies. So before we play the song, I just wanted to read what went into it, so you can really appreciate it when you hear it. So he wrote, "It is hard to comprehend the full scale of the horror of factory farms, where every second innumerable creatures of land and sea are cruelly slaughtered, after living lives of unspeakable misery. When I view footage of factory farms, what affects me more than the images are the sounds, the cries of loneliness, fear, pain, and madness. In these algorithmic piano pieces, I want to respond to these sounds, to call back even if my voice cannot be heard. Using publicly available research data, I have mapped the sonic environments of cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens, and transformed them from soundscapes of suffering and death into something else. Analyzing the acoustic dynamics of the distress calls of each animal, I have located the musical keys within which they speak. I have also captured the oral density of their environments, the decibel levels and amounts of variation, and used this to control various dynamics within each piece. Finally, I have calculated how many cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens are killed every second worldwide, and used this to control the tempo of the compositions. Each note you hear for the pieces sheep and cow indicates 5 deaths. For pig, it is 10 deaths. For chicken, it is 100. These pieces are for my friends of fur, feather, and scale. Until all of us are free, none of us are free. So, if you want to go check out some of Aragorn's music, you can go to further.co.za, and we'll post a link to that in the show notes. But this is the song Pig of Factory Farm Studies. Until next time,
Love and liberation.